Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Once again, I say welcome to you to our last day of the seminar on the World War I. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Once again, I say welcome to you to our last day of the seminar on the World War I. We have seen many students during the session, and we're very happy to be able to come to your presence at this great world-class event organized by INISEC. Today, we will also have this very special day, like our past 3 days. Today, we will begin with the Stalin presentation, and we will close the event. Remember that at the end of each presentation, we'll have the space for questions, and please ask them in the chat. So now, let's start with our last day of the seminar. Okay, to continue, let's introduce our next speaker, William Philpott. He joined the Department of the War Studies as a lecturer in September 2001, becoming professor of the history of the warfare in 2011. Professor Philpott is a president of the British Commission for the Military History. He has been a counselor of the National Army Museum and is a member of this collection of the Research Committee and Advisory Panel, Honorary Secretary of the Army Record Society, and Chair of the University of London Military Education Committee. So let's welcome Professor William. Thank you so much for joining us, and the audience is all yours to begin your presentation.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, though I would say that I've been given a vast canvas on which I can only sketch a very broad outline. I'm trying to look at the challenges of industrialized warfare that faced armies on the Western Front and focusing in on the British and French or the Allied experience. But to give some structure to this, I want to focus on 4 variables that run through the experience of industrialized warfare between 1914 and 1918. I call these the 4 M's. They are mass, material, mobility, and mobilization. And our guide to this process will be probably the First World War's greatest soldier, Marshal Ferdinand Foch. Foch is important not only for his military career between 1914 and 1918, but also because of the way he was instrumental in developing the method, the thought process behind the developmental methods that allow the Allies ultimately to master the challenges they faced on the industrial battlefield and to defeat the German armies under Foch's command as Generalissimo in 1918. And Foch, before the war, was a professor, a lecturer in tactics and strategy at the French Army Staff College, effectively lecturing on the operational level of war, which is emerging at the turn of the 20th century. And he certainly has a problem-solving approach to the challenges presented by warfare. One of his favorite phrases, de quoi s'agit-il? He's referred to students, what's the problem? What's the fundamental issue that you have got to address here? And he thought about this himself. He anticipated the coming problems of World War at the tactical and operational levels. If you read the various prefaces to his editions of his first edition of his staff lectures, Principles of War, first published in 1903, but republished several times thereafter before the outbreak of war. In each preface, he would reflect on what had changed since he first published the book, and he concludes in the final preface before the war with the statement, "While form evolves, the guiding principles remain the same." And the quotation I put up here indicates that he's thinking about just those variables that I've mentioned as important. He's talking about the impact of mass, huge conscript armies that are problematic to be directed by generals. And this links with the issue of command and control, the ability to mobilize, to move, to deploy, to fight with such huge military forces. And thirdly, he hints at the real problem is logistics supply, the material basis of these new armed forces. Food he mentioned here, but munitions also are going to be fundamental to the challenges that armed forces face when they go to war in the future. Foch is going to have to employ his own principle when he actually is faced with the realities of the battlefield after 1914. He soon realizes, and he recorded as saying, it was necessary to forget what he had learned and taught before the war when faced with the Western Front. Because he had this attitude, I think this is fundamental to explaining why he rose to become Allied Generalissimo, why he was able to drive the Germans out of France in 1918. I will develop that theme today. The other element of mass warfare, industrialized warfare, of course, lies beyond the armies, the battlefronts themselves. These wars will also be fought on a new emerging home front, because a mass war is a war of resources as well as a war of battles and armies. Not just your population resources, the men you can put into uniform, but also a nation's production, productivity, industrial potential, their resources in key raw materials, coal and iron in particular, in the wars of the early 20th century, which are the fundamentals of a modern industrialized economy, as well as plant, industrial manufacturing machinery, and also fundamentally shipping for a war that's global and relies on the resources of the whole world. And Foch again was aware of this. This quotation is taken from his post-war memoirs. It's quite clear from his pre-war writing and thinking that he's aware that war will be different because of the engagement of whole societies in the future. However, what are the armies that are going to go to war in 1914? In some ways, they still appear quasi-Napoleonic. They're still organized on the structural lines of infantry, artillery, cavalry, engineers. These wouldn't have been unfamiliar to military commanders a century previously. But they do have fledgling technical branches. Aviation, if you pardon the pun, is just taking off in European armies. It's only started to assume a military significance within the half decade before the war's outbreak, but as we know, it become very significant in the military methods developed as the war goes on. The French army itself was expanding before the war. There was a new army service law in 1913 that introduced 3 years of frontline service for the annual conscript contingent, therefore indicating war was developing another level of mass engagement, which meant that France could put 1.8 million men in the field in August 1914, deployed in 19 army corps with 47 active infantry, 10 cavalry divisions, plus 25 second line reserve divisions to reinforce the frontline troops in the later stages of the campaign. These armies, although organized in traditional ways, are showing the first signs of mechanization. Staff cars, dispatch riding motorcyclists perhaps, but essentially a 1914 army is horse-drawn and moves at walking pace. They do have modern weaponry, but not in great numbers, like all the European armies at this time. The French army has 2 machine guns per infantry battalion, 6 per regiment. What the French do have is firepower. This is going to be the dominant tactical system of the 20th century battlefield, and the French possess in the 75mm quick firing field gun probably the best weapon on either side of the war at this point. The French are well aware of the potential impact of firepower on the battlefield. Foch himself was an artillery officer, and he stressed when commenting on the education he himself received at the Staff College before the war on the importance of learning the centrality, the capabilities of firepower on the modern battlefield. To quote, he said, "The advance of any body of troops not possessing an unquestionable superiority of fire would be paralysed." The other dimension of this is the possession of heavy artillery. The French armies often said didn't have a heavy artillery capacity compared with the Germans in 1914. That's not entirely true, but the French and the Germans used their artillery differently. The French concentrated their field artillery on light, mobile, quick-firing guns, and they kept their heavy artillery, their siege weapons, as they like to identify them at this point, back at higher levels of command, with the army command or as a siege train to be deployed where necessary. The British Expeditionary Force that will join the French on the Western Front in 1914 is something different. It's a special case in relation to other European armies. A bit of a lightweight, to use a boxing term. It's small, it's professional, volunteer army, a long service army, which quite recently, since 1906, has formed its home components into a small, well-trained, well-organised, well-armed 6th Division expeditionary force for overseas warfare, potentially for reinforcing threats in the wider British Empire. What would happen when this lightweight army would be called up to fight alongside the heavyweights and against probably the heaviest army, the heavyweights army, the Germans, in 1914? It might be in danger of being swamped by mass conscript forces with deep pools of reserves. It was small. Could quality compensate for quantity? Compared with continental armies, the British Army was lavishly equipped with artillery. It had 76 guns in each infantry division, mostly 18-pounder field guns, including 18 4.5-inch howitzers and 4 heavier 60-pounder medium guns. Its cavalry, which it had 3 divisions in 1914, were also trained to perform the mounted infantry role. They could operate as reconnaissance cavalry and also dismount and fight as infantry, so making them a flexible, mobile force. But this small and well-trained army, here's the French military attache's verdict on this army in his report, his last report, I think, before 1914, basically praising the quality of the British Army. But the French monitored its preparation carefully before the war and were quite aware that it was small and didn't have a great capacity for expansion. It had reserves that would replace casualties over a 6-month period, the so-called special reserve. There wasn't much more regular force available. They could raise a few more divisions out of colonial garrisons, but the second line force, the territorial army of 13 divisions, was only committed to home defence before the war. Potentially they might get reinforcement from imperial contingents, both from the British Empire and India, and Dominion troops from Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa. But it was a good army. If it had a weakness, perhaps it was poorly led. It didn't understand the parameters of mass warfare on a continental scale. Before 1914, the French were trying to develop its abilities in this area. They were inviting British officers over to French army manoeuvres, but the process hadn't gone very far when war broke out in 1914. What of the bigger picture? How were the French strategically thinking about the next war that they were going to have to mount against Germany? Of course, they'd been invaded in 1870. They didn't want the Germans besieging Paris again, and they were well aware that the Germans planned to mount a sweep through Belgium. Although, looking at the map I put up here, they expected the sweep to be confined to the southern part of Belgium, south of the River Meuse, and the French Commander-in-Chief, Joseph Joffre, who'd been appointed in 1914, made his plans accordingly. His counter-offensive plan, Plan 17, was designed to strike from central France at any weak point that could be detected in the French line of advance once the campaign was underway. Nothing was fixed. The idea was the French would use their intelligence to gather information on the German advance, and then by a calculation of how many troops the Germans were deploying, identify a weak spot and commit their own reserves to counterattack at that weak spot, hopefully break the German invasion, the so-called Schlieffen maneuver through Belgium, either through attacking to the south in Alsace-Lorraine or pushing northwards against the pivot of the German maneuver in the Ardennes. So this is a good plan, I think. It's the right idea. It's a flexible response, we might call it to use modern terms, but it fell down in its execution in 1914. What was Joffre expecting of the British, his allies? Well, the Allies were latecomers to thinking about continental war, but certainly there's been a drift in that direction since the signing of the Anglo-French diplomatic Entente Cordiale in 1904. And also another event in 1904, the setting up for the first time of a British General Staff, essentially a planning staff that can prepare the British Army for war on the continent. This is a departure from Britain's traditional strategic approach to war, which is essentially a maritime, navalist, imperialist strategic approach to war. This shift in the British Army was backed up by British politicians, particularly the Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and the Secretary of State for War Edward Haldane, and very much encouraged by the French. I mentioned already that British officers were very welcome at French military manoeuvres in the years between the signing of the Entente Cordiale and the outbreak of war. So the British are undergoing a strategic realignment towards the continent, partly in response to the rising threat of Germany and the relative decline of France's other major ally, Russia, after 1905 with their defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. Although this process is by no means complete, when war breaks out, the British have to decide in August 1914 whether they will implement pre-existing deployment plans to send their army to join the French armies in the field to basically attach itself to the open French left flank in northern France. It takes a couple of days of discussion at a war council of Britain's military leaders before they realise actually they can't take any decision without consulting the French. A French delegation comes over, and only on the 12th of August is it finally decided to send, actually what turns out to be 2/3 of the expeditionary force in the first instance, 4 divisions plus a cavalry division, to concentrate in its assigned concentration point on the French left around the fortress of Maubeuge. But Lord Kitchener, Britain's new Secretary of State for War, is uncertain about this. In some ways, he's the obstacle the French and the British officers who want to deploy the continent have to overcome before he reluctantly agrees that the British Armed Expeditionary Force should go to France. He wants a more defensive posture and thinks about holding the British Army back as a more flexible global strategic reserve for deployment later in the war when it's been built up to a larger size. Maybe Kitchener's thinking was wise when you see what happens when the British and French armies encounter the German army for the first time on France's and Belgium's frontiers in August 1914. Essentially, not to put too fine a point on it, the French battles of the frontiers are a shambles. The basic idea to find a weak point in the German line and to strike at it doesn't work because there isn't a weak point, simply because, unlike the French, the Germans have deployed their reserve formations actively with their frontline active divisions for the invasion of France and Belgium. That means two things. The Germans have enough force once they've overcome the Belgian defences along the River Meuse, the fortresses at Liège and Namur, to actually advance in a much wider flanking movement than Joffre is expecting through northern Belgium, driving the Belgian army back to its national fortress at Antwerp and leaving the Allied left flank wide open to outflanking. Similarly, as Joffre probed for a weak spot along the German-French frontier to commit his reserve forces, the Fourth Army under General de Longueuil in the centre of the map here. Since he doesn't find it in Alsace and Lorraine, where he makes his first probing attacks, since he doesn't find it in Belgium, where his Fifth Army makes probing attacks, he assumes it'll be in the middle. So he rushes the Third and Fourth Armies up through the centre of the position towards the Ardennes, where they blunder rather blindly. There's poor reconnaissance into the German Fourth Army advancing obliquely, following up the Third Army into Belgium, and there's a rather chaotic most recent historiography suggests that the French actually had good opportunities to punch their way through gaps in the German Fourth Army's defensive line, but their lack of reconnaissance, their weak command and control, their weak tactical sense relative to the Germans meant they missed these opportunities. And by the end of the 22nd of August, which by a long shot is the day in which the French army suffers more casualties than any in the war, a decision is taken that they have to retreat from the Ardennes, and that begins a general retreat along the Allied line, particularly because the British engage at Mons the day after. The French Fifth Army are engaging along the River Sambre against those German forces sweeping through Belgium, and they realise that their left flank is weak, about to be turned. So Joffre orders a general retreat all along the Franco-British line. Why did this happen? It's a significant defeat. Is it a problem of doctrine? Is it a problem of command and control? Is it a problem of coalition war? Joffre couldn't control the Belgians, the British, who essentially are the forces to protect his weak flank, for example. Was it Joffre's fault? Was it a failure of perception, of intelligence, expecting only a certain number of German divisions to invade France when there were more? He was not willing to adopt his preconceived expectations when the intelligence picture altered. The doctrine wasn't effective in 1914. That's not to say it was wrong. French infantry doctrine privileged shock action over firepower. but not through the sort of the unsupported bayonet charges that have come down to posterity and been mythologized in some of the more sensationalist works about the First World War. Essentially, the French 75mm field gun was designed to fire against, suppress the enemy's infantry line in order for the French infantry to close with it and defeat it. So firepower is integral to French tactics. The Germans, on the other hand, used their heavier artillery to target the French artillery, to reduce the supporting fire that the French infantry had, allowing their own infantry to close with the French. So in some ways we have two similar but not identical doctrines that mix the firepower of artillery with the shock action of infantry, and in the first encounters the German system proves more effective. But the French system is equally effective in inflicting heavy casualties on German troops advancing against French positions. Possibly even more so the British system demonstrated, for example, at Mons, which checks the German advance against their positions for a couple of days. But I would stress that you learn quickly in these situations. I put a quotation up from General Marie-Émile Fayolle, who's a divisional commander in the defense of French positions of the Grand Couronne at Nancy in August 1914. He's commanding the 70th Reserve Division, sitting there in the middle of your screen. He writes in his diary after his first battle, "An obvious lesson. I attacked with the greatest care, lots of artillery and the fewest infantry possible. This will become a material war, a war in which firepower is to be used." You won't be surprised to know that Fayolle was also an artilleryman, and he'd been a lecturer in artillery tactics at the French Staff College before the war. But what we do see in 1914 is the adaptability of the French army at the operational and strategic levels, even if their early tactics have significant flaws. The best example of this is the Marne counterattack organized by General Joffre in early September. He's pulled his armies back. He hasn't lost cohesion or command and control. They fought some successful delaying, disengaging actions and retreated back behind the River Marne. And then they'll turn to face the enemy. And in the meantime, what Joffre has done, taking advantage of the mobile advantage of speed of railway communications as opposed to the speed and advance of the Germans, who are advancing at essentially at walking pace, to redeploy forces from his own right wing to his threatened left. The Germans have turned and marching in front of Paris, and a new French army, the 6th Army, will strike against their open flank from Paris, while in the centre the British Expeditionary Force, which is pulled back alongside the French left, and the French 5th Army will push through a gap that opens between the two right flank German armies, the 1st and the 2nd Armies, allowing a successful counterattack and driving the German forces back to the heights above the River Aisne, which you'll see at the top of the map there. What the Battle of the Marne shows is the resilience of mass armies. Joffre can redeploy spare forces. Not only can he shift troops from one flank to the other along the railways. Joffre just so happened to have been the French Army's director of railway logistics before he became commander-in-chief, so he knew all about the strategic use of railways, and there's a great example of it here. But not only did you have extra troops, you had reserve divisions not yet deployed, like the Germans had deployed, to be sent forward and reinforce the French line. You also had a mass of trained reservists, as yet not deployed, who could fill up those huge gaps in the French infantry ranks that had come about on account of their serious casualties on the French on the frontier on the 22nd of August. But although this might be seen as a decisive battle in 1914, stops the German advance, stops a quick defeat of France, possibly you might therefore say it's the decisive battle of the war, because the Germans will never have another opportunity of this sort to win. It's still a long way from defeating the German army. Now, it might be argued that if you get things right at the beginning, you don't have to adapt quickly. But I think this is a classic example of that military principle, attributed to Helmut von Moltke the Elder: no plan survives first contact with the enemy. I think the lesson here is that, barring a disaster, the adaptable army will survive. Possibly, if you compare it with what happened to the French army in 1940, that reinforces that lesson. But mass warfare, restricted mobility of troops advancing the end of their logistical chain at the walking pace, indicate that quick, decisive, strategic victory is not possible in the particular circumstances of the Western Front, and that lesson will be reinforced through the remainder of the 1914 campaign, which I can't go into in detail, just to say that it ends up, after successive attempts to outflank each other, with the Allied and German lines resting on the North Sea. Essentially, they run out of space in which to manoeuvre. How did the British Army get on in this situation, the small army fighting with the bigger continental forces? It probably wasn't really ready, although its deployment to the continent had been anticipated. Several more years were probably needed to complete the process of getting it ready for continental war. The traumatic and divisive experience of August 1914 did not do much also for command relations between Joffre and his British opposite number, Sir John French. French was all for marching his troops back to the French ports, going back to Britain after the defeat on the frontiers. Had to be forced to go back and fight alongside the French by Lord Kitchener, who was now Secretary of State for War, turning up and essentially ordering him to do so. But on the ground, the old contemptibles, as the original British Expeditionary Force were dubbed apparently by the Kaiser, Britain's contemptible little army, lived up to the high expectations that the French had of them in 1914 battles. They weren't big, but they might have been a make-weight between the mass armies on either side. They were tactically effective, both at Mons and the subsequent battle at Le Cateau and on the Marne. But I think, heroic, glorified though it is, the British Army's war in 1914 represents a sort of warfare that is passing. An old style, all volunteer professional army will pass with it. Where it did fail, I think, was at the higher levels of command and leadership. The divisional commanders seem to do better than the corps commanders, and certainly better than General Headquarters under Sir John French's direction, who still, I think, feel they are fighting the open warfare that Britain has most recently experienced in South Africa at the turn of the century. At the end of 1914, armies have to pause to think about, contemplate the future. I think anticipating, meeting the strategic, tactical and operational challenges of 1914 is not the same as adapting to those that will follow the stalemate, the static warfare that sets in for the next 3 years of war, essentially. Between 1914 and 1918, the Napoleonic-style armies would become 20th century modern mechanized armies. But in the meantime, they subsisted under what one French commander, General Eugène Debony, who would be a successful commander in the war, later dubbed the tyranny of material. The material-intensive nature of the war, particularly the need to produce, deploy, and understand how to use this new material, would slow and immobilize warfare between 1915 and 1917. These are the materials of an industrial age. Weaponry, munitions, transportation systems that the armies are only glimpsing as they go to war in 1914, but will become commonplace by 1918 and thereafter. This is not just a question of material itself, technology deployed, it's also a question of the methods used. How do you run a mass mechanized army, and with that also a mass mechanized navy and the new service, the Air Force, that will emerge during the course of the First World War? How do you then use these forces to achieve the operational aims of battle and the strategic purposes of war? And there's a move away from what you might call classical generalship, if that's a concept, to a more managerial approach to organizing warfare, to making war, a systems approach. It goes back to Foch's identification that the armies have outgrown the brains of those who direct them. You need to think much more about the process of war in the round, not just about what happens when troops encounter each other on the battlefield. And this has to be rethought for war that will, in time, become faster in tempo as mechanization starts to impose itself on the battlefield from 1917 onwards. This sort of warfare will be controlled by new communication systems. I think the unsung weapons of the First World War are the typewriter, the telephone, the automatic copying machine, all of which allowed the vast bureaucratic paperwork on which these new managerial types of armies functioned, subsisted to operate effectively. This is only one element of a process of mobilization that all belligerent societies go through during the course of the First World War. Starting in 1914, but takes off really from 1915, reaches its zenith by 1917. There's not seen to be a great need for mobilization immediately the war breaks out, in the expectation that the armies will do their job and the war will be over quickly. But by the end of the year, there's a realization that's not going to be the case. In fact, Kitchener, Britain's Secretary of State for War, seen here in the famous recruiting poster that bears his image, knew fundamentally that the war would be made, as he said in a press interview in August 1914, to the last man and the last horse. And Penaud, the French military attaché, was pleased to report back to Paris that one thing is clear: he has decided to conduct war to the bitter end. For Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, that meant Britain would have to mobilize appropriately to match continental scale armies, play them at their own game. There are various elements to the mobilization process, which I don't have time to go in any great detail today, but there's a list here to give some indication of how armies change, how societies adapt, and the impact this will have as the process is undertaken. But essentially, we see the state stepping in to organise a so-called war effort. The state expands, takes control of industry, intervenes in private lives, conscripts both men of the armed forces and onto the home front. And there's a question, of course, as the war develops, which is the decisive front? Will it be the military front, where the soldiers are fighting, or the home front, which increasingly is relied upon to produce the vast amounts of and increasingly large amounts of war material that these mass armies will consume when operating the new methods of warfare after 1915. So war becomes not only a military contest, but also an economic contest. For Britain, it meant abandoning the voluntary principle. Kitchener famously raised his armies, his Kitchener armies, in 1914-15 based on volunteers. But it was quite clear by the middle of 1915 they weren't going to get enough men to volunteer. So at the end of 1915, Britain passes a conscription law for military manpower that comes into place in March 1916. So by the time of its major offensive in the second half of the war, the army is becoming increasingly a conscript force. Similarly, although not conscripted, the places of men in the home economy would be taken by women, who became a mainstay of industrial economies, not just in Britain, but in other belligerents as well. The other thing that the people would contribute to the war, we shouldn't forget, is their money. They would pay higher taxes, they would purchase government war bonds to finance the war. So essentially, people were taking both an emotional and a financial investment in the war, which, although we look back on it a century later and wonder how societies could have engaged with, endured and accepted this sort of conflict, we must understand by the end of 1914 had become a very popular war in response to the actions taken by the belligerents on either side. The people were in this war, they were fully mobilized or increasingly mobilized during the course of 1915 into 1916, either to fight or to sustain the mass armies that were fighting at the front. These armies had a problem, or a new type of warfare, or maybe a very old type of warfare, a reversion to siege warfare, what we call trench warfare. But the strategic and operational problem encountered thereafter on the Western Front was how to break the defensive walls of the siege of Germany, which essentially were the lines that they set up in France and elsewhere, and how to liberate occupied France and Belgium. The broad strategic geography of the new Western Front is a salient that pushes into France, and Joffre's plan is to attack the flank of that salient, since there's a flank to turn, to strike through the German positions, to break through, in the term used at the time, although a rather amorphous term, which is probably not properly understood as a military concept, to break through the German lines, to strike at their strategic communications, the railway lines you see on this map, and therefore oblige them to withdraw from the Noyon salient, as it's known, named after the town of Noyon, which you'll see there at the apex of the salient. Practically, he didn't have the forces to attack all along the line, or the equipment, the wherewithal, so he chose to attack the two flanks of this salient in the north, in Artois, with some support from the British Army, which is still expanding during 1914, and also to the south in Champagne. You can see the broad outline of those schemes on the diagram there. This was an attempt to take the dominating high ground all along the Western Front, on which the Germans had sensibly, cleverly, military doctrine dictated it, established their defensive positions. The Allies would start attacking these in 1915, but without great success. The first example, the first major offensive on the Western Front in 1915 was the Second Battle of Artois. There's been some desultory fighting in Artois over the winter, so a more systematic, organized attack is made in the spring, in May and June. Essentially, the tactical problem that the French encounter is to take the Vimy Ridge, now known for the Canadian monument that sits atop, which you can see as a little white dot in the photograph, the contemporary photograph. But in the Second Battle of Artois, attacked by troops of the 33rd Army Corps, actually commanded by General Philippe Pétain, who would go on to better things. He would be the French Army's commander-in-chief by 1918. Within his corps was actually Fayoll's 70th Division, and the hope of the French is they can break through the German lines in the centre and storm the heights of the Vimy Ridge. They do this, but in doing so, it demonstrates the problems of fighting on an entrenched battlefield. To either flank of the 33rd Corps' attack, you've got the 21st Army Corps in the north, capturing a spur of the Vimy Ridge, the Notre Dame de Lorette spur, which they've been fighting on since November, trying to capture. And the south, you've got the 20th Army Corps trying to capture a complicated position in the German defences, which rightly goes under the name of the labyrinth. And because on either flank, the French troops get bogged down in trench fighting, it means although the breakthrough in the centre appears to be successful, the Germans to north and south are quite able to isolate the troops that have broken through, to counterattack from north, south and east, and drive the Moroccan troops essentially back to positions from which they commenced their attack. So the Second Battle of Artois, important because it establishes the key principles of infantry doctrine very early in the war, the effective combination of artillery firepower and infantry assault tactics, but it also shows up some of the problems. Shows that battles of this nature can lead huge amounts of munitions, which the Allies simply do not have to sustain battles for a long period of time. Secondly, you need a large front of attack, otherwise your penetration, your breakthrough is going to be contained, counterattacked and repulsed. It also shows that overambitious operations that try to thrust through the centre of the German line aren't going to work, because you soon lose cohesion. Command and control breaks down. Pétain was unable to reinforce, resupply the troops that had got established on the Vimy Ridge, the Moroccan division, who left their monument on the ridge to mark their achievement, but who were unable to hold their positions. But this is a battle through which lessons are learned. Foch is indirectly responsible for this battle. He's actually French Army Group Commander in the north by this point, and he oversees the operation and he takes careful note of what was and was not effective on the battlefield. So I think even with the first major attack mounted by the Allies, the nature of the problems is becoming apparent. Where are you going to find solutions? In tactical adaptation, in doctrinal change, or in the deployment of new technology or more material. The Allies try again in the autumn. There's a third Battle of Artois in September, October. The French attack again against the Vimy Ridge, and to their north, the British attack in the so-called Battle of Loos to try to break through and essentially support the French attack on the Vimy Ridge. What has been learnt from the Second Battle of Artois, I think, is quite clear in the way Foch approaches his next offensive. He undertakes a methodical advance rather than trying to rush the enemy's position, as Pétain's troops had done in the spring without concrete results. His lessons from the 1915 fighting are clear. I put up an extract from the report he passed back to Joffre on this battle, essentially arguing for a more methodical, material intensive approach to conducting operations. And he states elsewhere, battle consists of a repetition of operations in which first one attacks a position with all the necessary artillery, then one throws enough infantry forward to that position while the artillery progresses to the following position. These are the principles of so-called scientific battle, as he will call it, in 1916. Totally they're the ideas that Fayol has identified in 1914. What Foch is arguing is what the artillery can achieve governs both the planning of, the preparation for, and the progress of offensive operations. Essentially, it's material, the artillery numbers, availability of munitions that dictate what you can and can't do on the battlefield. The British at Loos are demonstrating what happens if you don't adhere to this principle. Their first day attack is a mixed affair. They get some lodgements in the German positions. They try to use actually another innovation, gas, to cover up for the fact that they haven't got anywhere near as much artillery to support the operation as the French. On day two, they try and force a breach in the German second line by committing a couple of divisions of Kitchener's New Army, who haven't been deployed before, without an artillery supporting barrage. These divisions essentially are cut to pieces by the German defense, which is by now alert, reinforced by machine guns, and these new untrained troops break and flee from the battlefield. So a classic example of an inability to adapt, to grasp the practicalities of the battlefield until it's too late. So we have these contrasting approaches in 1915. The more systematic approach that's emerged on the Vimy Ridge, from the Vimy Ridge battles, and the more what I would call Russian hope approach that the British are still pursuing at Loos. If this lesson needs any reinforcement, it can be seen from the contemporaneous Second Battle of Champagne. Joffre is trying in his second offensive to attack both flanks of the German salient in France. There's mixed success in Champagne. The French methods, material intensive, proper infantry artillery combination, are effective enough to take a large section of the German front positions in the Champagne. It's when they push against the German second position, something the Germans have started building after the French broke through on the Vimy Ridge in the spring. Once the French push against the second position, they make a few small penetrations in that position, but they don't master the whole position. And as they concentrate their reserve to try to push through, the same thing happens as happened to the Moroccans on Vimy Ridge. They are basically contained, destroyed by concentrated fire from the flanks. So what we can see is not so much a problem of tactics. The tactics work if your method is right, you have enough shells, you have well-trained troops. The problem is operations, how you can turn these attacks to strategic advantage. The next test will come in 1916, associated particularly with the Somme offensive that occupies the British and French armies side by side from late June until November. Mass has imposed a new strategic dynamic on warfare by 1916, and that is the dynamic of attrition. You'll see the strategic objective set by the Allies for the 1916 campaign is not to break through, to maneuver to liberate France. It's simply the destruction of the German and Austrian armies, to destroy the enemy's forces by a process of attrition. How to do that? You'll try to simultaneously attack them on all fronts so they can't move their reserves around and contain and counterattack individual Allied offensives. For the British and French, this means destroying the German armies in France. There's still some debate on the best method to do this. General de Castelnau actually directed the French operation in Champagne, is now Joffre's chief of staff, believes you can upgrade from breakthrough to what he calls rupture, an offensive big and powerful enough to basically break down a large section of the German defensive line. Foch, who will be directing the Somme battle, he's Northern Army Group commander, instead promotes his methodical approach to operations, what he calls the offensive de longue durée, a long drawn out steady operation. Douglas Haig, commanding or directing the British part of the battle, still adheres to the idea that you can break through the German defences and push forces forward and return to a more mobile, flexible type of warfare. The simple tactical problem, the same as in 1915, was to seize the German front lines, take the second and third positions and exploit beyond, either by using a step-by-step scientific battle approach advocated by Foch and Fayolle. Fayolle will be the main French army commander, commanding the 6th Army in the Somme offensive. He's been promoted through corps command of Pétain's corps up to army command within a year. He's showing his talent. Rawlinson actually probably favoured the step-by-step approach, but was instructed by his commander, Douglas Haig, Rawlinson commanding the British 4th Army, instructed by Haig to attempt a decisive dynamic breakthrough operation. The Somme by June is not the plan of the winter and spring. It's shrunk by about 60% from de Castelnau and Foch's original plan, which might have produced a rupture. Essentially, French reserves have been sucked into the defence of the fortress of Verdun at the other end of the front. This is the German commander von Falkenhayn's attempt to impose attrition on the Allies in his own way, on his own terms. When it comes to the Somme offensive itself, it is long, it is drawn out, it is attritional. More casualties than at Verdun for the Allied armies, about 600,000, and more for the Germans too, although the actual figures are disputed, certainly around 500,000. It does default, whatever Douglas Haig's intentions at the beginning, after the British attack on the 1st July goes disastrously wrong, the bloodiest day in British military history. It does revert to Foch's bataille de longue durée, a series of separate offensives conducted by British and French armies to push their lines slowly forwards, in the process of that grinding up the German defences in front of them. But we can see from the contrast between French success on the 1st of July 1916, in which they take all their objectives in a couple of hours with minimal casualties, about 1,500, the effectiveness of the new scientific battle methods properly employed, although the British had tried to learn from, absorb some of the French lessons. As an inexperienced army, they could not put these into practice as well as the French commanders. Nevertheless, the battle does enough to carry on as part of a so-called general Allied offensive until winter weather closes it down in the middle of November. I think the second phase of the battle, which we tend to forget, is more significant because we see a rather bigger, better managed battle. Foch, by this point, taking the battle in hand. He's systematically directing 4 Allied armies, 2 British and 2 French, delivering blow by blow sequentially against the German positions as an attempt to pummel the enemy into submission. And I think a measure of success should not be seen as the ground captured in this offensive, but the damage inflicted on the manpower, the material and the morale of the enemy, according to the objective set in December 1950. When there were breakthroughs in the German positions, they were small and could not be exploited, but the French army broke through on the 2nd of July and the 15th of and the 12th of September rather, and actually the British broke through when they renewed the offensive with tanks for the first time on the 15th of September. So by September, you've got a very different sort of battle taking place, I think. Both British and French armies are starting to demonstrate a combination of better operational mobility with more effective attrition. But it's not fast enough, mainly because the logistical systems break down. They cannot supply the material in the vast quantities required over the battlefield that this sort of offensive creates. But Weygand, Geoff Foch's chief of staff, writes at the beginning of 1917, reflecting on the Somme, that this manoeuvre by movement along the front is the only way on a front on which one cannot turn the flanks and can be managed against an enemy with inferior numbers. The enemy command will be uncertain and worried and will be demoralized rapidly the more its reserves are committed and it suffers partial defeats. Finally, the last blow struck will find them materially and morally powerless. This is written at the start of 1917. This is essentially how the Germans will be defeated when Foch is given free rein a year later in 1918. There's a difficult year in between, which I can skirt over quickly. There's a regression of tactics and operational method in the Nivelle offensive in the spring. Joffre is sacked by the French government, replaced by Robert Nivelle, who's done well in the final phase of the Battle of Verdun, a couple of successful tactical victories. And Nivelle, on the basis of this, claims he has a new way of doing things and will be able to bring about a decisive defeat for the Germans in quick time. He does not, as Fayol comments on Nivelle's victories. It was the result of the methods used on the Somme, reconfigured by Magnan, who was Nivelle's subordinate commander. I won't look in any detail on the Nivelle offensive. It does show that the Allied armies had learned significantly. Now the Vimy Ridge, that couldn't be taken in 1915, was captured using the proper material intensive bite and hold methods, as they're now called, by the Canadian Corps at the start of the British phase of this operation, the Battle of Arras. That's probably the best phase of this battle, which doesn't work, grinds down into or reverts to another attritional battle thereafter. On the home front, there's a sign that war weariness is settling in. There are mutinies in the French army following the events on the Chemin des Dames, the Nivelle offensive. There's trouble on the home front, popular disturbance, strikes, anti-war propaganda. sparked by events developing in Russia, where essentially the front has collapsed, the home front has collapsed, leads to a period of government instability in France until Georges Clemenceau steps in at the end of November 1917 and offers the French people war, nothing but war. And by this point, I think the French have adapted to this process. The British too are having a crisis of confidence on the home front, and there has been more attention paid to explaining to civilians and soldiers what the war is about and why the war needs to be continued. But the big question arises, can the armies end the war before the home fronts collapse into civil war and revolution, as has been witnessed in Russia? Thirdly, in 1917, there's a process of retooling, creating these modern mechanized armies, most obviously manifest in the tank, but also in the artillery, the aircraft, the truck-based logistics, all of which start to impose themselves on the battlefield during the course of 1917. Pétain famously said when he took over command of the French army after Nivelle was relieved, we should wait for the Americans and the tanks. Again, huge numbers of American troops being mobilized, the tanks, the materiel, the new sorts of war materials by which we can fight these battles effectively. So by the end of 1917, there's been a re-engagement of the French army with the war. Above all, the material that makes this happen is shells, munitions. Overwhelming firepower is the instrument of success in the second half of 1917, epitomized by the Battle of Malmaison, in which the French army essentially blasts the German defences off the Cheminots Dam, which Nivelle's offensive has not captured in spring 1917. Essentially, this is the last ridge, has now fallen to the Allies. The Allies have tactical control all over the Western Front. And this is done by material-intensive, firepower-dominated tactics, although as you'll see from the photo I put up there of the Cheminots Dam battlefield, it makes rather a mess of the ground, and it does compromise forward mobility and exploitation. In some ways, that's not a problem if you understand the way battles develop. We see things happening differently in 1918. The Germans make a strategic offensive, mainly because they can, but also I think because they have to. They've lost the tactical initiative on the Western Front during 1917. Foch is appointed Allied Generalissimo, and he quips rather tongue-in-cheek to Clemenceau, "You have given me a lost battle and expect me to win it." Because I think Foch knew exactly how to win this battle, or at least how not to lose it. I put up a little sketch here that Foch drew at the time. He understood the momentum of any German advance, if it kept pushing in the same space, would run out, would diminish day by day until the Allies could redeploy their reserves and contain the German thrust. And that is essentially what happened every time the Germans attacked along the Western Front in spring and early summer 1917. Foch also knew that this would happen if he attacked the other way, but from his experience on the Somme, he understood that rather than pushing forwards, you stop when the enemy's resistance consolidates and you move your point of attack elsewhere along the line. So this perhaps is a fifth M we should be aware of, method. The method that has emerged from the experience of fighting between 1915 and 1917. And it's manifested in the final Allied offensive that Foch controls between August and November 1917, when the Germans are essentially manoeuvred out of or pushed out of France and Belgium in relatively quick time. This is the wave theory in his little sketch, working in reverse. It's the army front scale battles of September 1916, 4 armies on the Somme, upscaled, so the 17 armies that Foch is controlling by 1918 are systematically attacking to integrate their individual operations towards a consistent strategic objective that Joffre has set the Allied commanders now under his authority. Foch was ready for that. He promised to Clemenceau and the Allied political leaders in January 1918 that when it was ready, he wanted to be in a position to develop separate actions in the form of a combined decisive offensive if the attrition of the enemy or any favourable circumstance in the general situation allows us to anticipate success from doing so. And when he got that opportunity in August, it was only a matter of a few months before he could impose his will upon the enemy. We see in Foch's method of 1918 greater speed, mobility, much more use of material, a new, or not new, by now a familiar tactical operational method that's been developing since 1915. We also see war on a scale that you haven't witnessed previously. A mass comes into play. The Americans are starting to deploy. A couple of American armies will be engaged in the final phase of this operation. Doesn't allow the enemy to regain his footing once attacked. But I would stress at the heart of Foch's method was attrition. The objective is still the same as that set in December 1915, the destruction of the German army. You can see in the count of Allied prisoners, the amounts of material the Allied armies take in this offensive, that by this process they're destroying the fighting capacity of the German army. Essentially, Foch was aiming not at territory, although he did effectively liberate France and Belgium, by destroying essentially the manpower, the material and the morale of the enemy at the same time at a rapid pace. Different to Joffre and Hay's conception of battle early in the war, which was a more phased idea of engagement, attrition, breakthrough and exploitation. In Foch's battle, the bataille conduite, as he called it, all these were being done at exactly the same time. He was extending them in time and in space, as opposed to early offensive that had concentrated all effort on one particular point of the front. Tout le monde la bataille, another one of Foch's expressions of 1918. Essentially, this is what we have. We have mass warfare. We have everyone fighting at the same time along the Western Front, accelerating the pace of operations in 1916, allowing the destruction that was not possible, although desired in the Somme offensive. To conclude, of course, Foch didn't do this all himself, but he was the directing mind, the brain, not only the commander, but also the theorist who thought out the right way to do this. He had many talented subordinates by this time in charge of British, French and other formations on the Western Front. A lot of all the staff officers, commanders of French forces had actually been taught by Foch in the Staff College before the war. But Foch is central to the story of how the Allied armies changed and how they won victory in 1918. He worked out how to use mass armies in new ways to achieve the operational and strategic ends of warfare. And we can step back and see that trench warfare doesn't actually last very long. Although it epitomizes the First World War, it's a short part of a continuum, a move between two different conceptions, two different phases of mobile operations, one Napoleonic, one modern, for want of a better term. You haven't used the term Phocian, but I think it's appropriate. Just to end with an observation, Haig actually reported contemptuously the view in Paris in October 1918, the claim that Foch is suffering from a swollen head and thinks himself another Napoleon. I don't think he's another Napoleon. I don't think Napoleon would have been comfortable operating the armies of 1918, although he was probably done okay with those of 1914. They worked in the same way that the armies he commanded had worked. But it's the four M's: it's mass, it's mobility, it's material intensity, it's popular mobilization, that are features of the new warfare that Foch grasps, Foch develops and practices in his response to the strategic questions posed by the German invasion and occupation of France in 1914, in ways I think that his enemy Ludendorff, his ally Haig, did not. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your participation and giving the audience such an incredible and complete topic. Professor William, thank you very much. So during the presentation, we received some questions in the chat. We will try to answer one of them. I just like to hand over to David to get your start with some questions from the public. David, ¿qué te parece si iniciamos algunas preguntas que tiene la audiencia en este momento? Ah, estás en mute.
Ahora, disculpad. Sí, tenemos algunas preguntas que nos han enviado los alumnos. Son las siguientes. La primera de ellas, de 1914 a 1918, Europa fue el escenario de una guerra mundial marcada por una escala de violencia nunca vista, hecho posible por los adelantos tecnológicos de la industria militar. Un conflicto que cobró la vida de millones y barrió ciudades enteras. ¿Podemos considerar la Primera Guerra Mundial como el primer conflicto militar industrializado de la era contemporánea?
Okay, the first question is about from 1940 to 1918, Europe was the scene of a world war marked by a scale of violence never seen before, maybe made possible by the technological advance of the military industry, a conflict that claimed the lives of millions and swept away entire cities. A conflict that claimed the life of millions and way up entire cities. Can we consider that the World War I as the first industrialized military conflict of the contemporary era?
I think that's correct. I mean, when you think about military technology, of course, they always progress. You might argue that the American Civil War was an industrialized war in terms of certain elements of it. The railways were used, telegraphs were used, communication technologies were industrialized. But I think where the First World War differs is the technologies that are deployed on the battlefield are industrial technologies. Essentially, American Civil War armies, even Franco-Prussian war armies in the 1870s, are using technologies that haven't come that far in the previous century. Muskets or muzzle loading cannons, or rather early iron guns. But what differs by 1914 is the ability to concentrate fire by new technologies. But we shouldn't say technology is all that matters. I think what I tried to stress, it's material counts, but mass is what matters. You're going to kill more soldiers because societies are organized to put far more soldiers onto the battlefield. Proportionately, you're probably not suffering heavier casualties out of the troops you deploy on the Somme for 10 months, as opposed to troops you would have engaged for one day on a Franco-Prussian war battlefield. We tend to think because of the absolute number of casualties that armies suffer in the First World War, this is an exception out of the range of modern of warfare. But I think it's a manifestation of a new way of doing things. Certainly, it's a reflection that there were more men to be killed. The technologies at their disposal were more effective at killing. But also, I think we shouldn't forget that the men there were determined to kill each other. There's a way of thinking that emerged after the war, of course, that the soldiers were victims of all this. Their commanders didn't know what they were doing. I think they knew exactly what they're doing, and their armies, their soldiery were complicit in this. The killers of the First World War ultimately are not generals who didn't know what they were doing. They are soldiers who are mobilized, indoctrinated, determined to engage with and kill each other on either side until victory. Essentially, it becomes a war of survival. You either win or your society collapses. It becomes an existential conflict. We see what happens in Russia in 1917. We'll see that Germany collapsed into revolution in 1918. Britain and France don't come out of this war unscathed on the home front, but essentially their political system survives. I wouldn't say it prospers between the wars, but in a war, an all or nothing war, where populations are bigger fundamentally than in previous conflicts, more men go to war, more technology is there for fighting the war, and there's more determination. Victory at whatever cost. This is why you get a war of this nature. It's a mass war. It's a war of attrition.
Thank you very much, Professor William, for your answer. David, ¿qué te parece si continuamos con una siguiente pregunta por parte de la audiencia?
Tenemos una segunda pregunta que dice así: en vísperas del estallido de las hostilidades, Europa se encontraba en plena segunda revolución industrial. Las sucesivas innovaciones técnicas pues hacían surgir cada vez más fábricas y fábricas en las ciudades, cuya productividad pues se disparó hasta niveles nunca vistos hasta ese momento. Una evolución aprovechada en cada nación a favor de la carrera armamentística en curso. ¿Podemos considerar que la mujer tuvo un papel determinante en las fábricas produciendo armamento y equipos militares para que la economía de guerra no se detuviera?
Okay, the second question that have the audience is about, on the eve of the outbreak of hostilities, Europe was in the midst of the second industrial revolutions. Successive technical innovation led to the emergence of more and more factories in the cities, whose productivity soared and unprecedented levels, a development that was exploited in every nation to benefit of the arms race underway. But the question for that is, can we consider that the woman play a decisive role in the factories producing armaments and military equipment so that the war economy would not stop?
I certainly would say they played a very important role. Whether you call it decisive, that's possibly not the right word, but certainly a fundamental, a crucial role, certainly. Because you've got to fight, and that requires manpower, men, to put on military uniforms. You need to fill spaces in the industrial economy with female labour. We mustn't also forget there's a mass mobilisation of imperial populations to redeploy to work as labourers behind the front, or to work in war industries, either in metropolitan France or in new industries created, say, in India, in the British Empire. So it's a mobilisation of all human resources, male, female, white, imperial. So in that respect, women are a part of a broader process. I wouldn't distinguish them in that way as being decisive. But I would also stress that war gives opportunities to women that they wouldn't have ever had in peacetime, to such an extent that not only I should put up a picture of women munitions workers, which is well known, but opportunities, essentially by the end of the war, in Britain, though not elsewhere, women are serving in support service in the military. You have women's uniformed services. The other area, of course, where women make a big contribution is in the medical services, in nursing, behind the lines and at home. But there's a move away from what would have been considered before the war traditional female roles into male roles. I think that's the difference. And also, interestingly, a lot of arguments about whether women were emancipated by their experience in the war, or whether when the men came home from the front, essentially women were expected to return to pre-war gender roles. I think you can see evidence for both sides of that, but certainly manifested in the fact that the British suffragette or suffragist movements before the First World War hadn't made much political progress against essentially a male-dominated political system. The consequence of the First World War was women getting the right to vote in Britain. Interestingly, in France, similar consequence did not happen. Most other places, women got the right to vote after the war. France did not grant women the right to vote until after the Second World War. So possibly France has a more conservative, patriarchal society than Britain in this respect. But I would stress, yes, the place of women in the war economy is very important, but I couldn't identify the fact that using women more effectively on one side or the other, or in one way or another, was decisive. In a sense, what is a decisive military encounter? I think if you think, was the war won on the home front or on the battlefront? I think it was won on the battlefront, but the battlefront essentially are sustained by effective home fronts, and so mobilization on both sides goes deeper and more effective on the Allied side than the German.
Excellent answer, Professor William. And thank you very much for your participation in the World War I seminar. Thank you for being part of this event.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I would like to give the floor to David to give a brief summary of what we've seen in the presentation. David, te cedo la palabra para iniciar con nuestro breve resumen de lo que vimos en la ponencia con el profesor William.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Desde INISEC quería agradecer al doctor William Philpott, profesor de estudios de la guerra del King's College de Londres, nuestro agradecimiento por su participación en este seminario sobre la Primera Guerra Mundial y felicitarle por su magnífica ponencia sobre adaptación a los retos de la guerra industrializada, la experiencia británica y francesa en el frente occidental. Desde 1914 al 18, como ha ido analizando el profesor Philpott a lo largo de su ponencia, Europa fue el escenario de una guerra mundial marcada por una escala de violencia nunca vista, hecha posible por los adelantos tecnológicos de la industria militar. Fue un conflicto que cobró la vida de millones y varias ciudades enteras. En vísperas de ese estallido de las hostilidades, Europa se encontraba en plena segunda revolución industrial. Las sucesivas innovaciones técnicas hacían surgir cada vez más fábricas en todas las ciudades, cuya productividad se disparó hasta niveles realmente muy importantes. Una evolución que, aprovechada en cada nación a favor de esa carrera armamentística en curso, vimos que en agosto de ese 1914, al estallar la guerra, el ejército francés demandaba una producción de casi 10.000 proyectiles de artillería diarios. A finales de septiembre exigía 10 veces más. Después de unos enfrentamientos que se inscribían en una clásica guerra de movimientos, el frente se estancó, al tiempo que los combates se intensificaban cada vez más y requerían más recursos. Los protagonistas se disparaban entre sí desde distancias muy cortas, a veces metros, desde unas trincheras que se convirtieron en las tumbas de millones de combatientes, como muy bien nos ha explicado el profesor Philpott a lo largo de su intervención. Con el fin de alimentar esa maquinaria bélica, aceleraron la producción. En Francia, más de 15.000 empresas se pusieron al servicio de la defensa nacional, mientras que las autoridades planteaban una reorganización casi total de la economía debido a esa ocupación alemana. Al volver, digamos, inaccesibles esas fábricas y yacimientos del norte y este del país, las tropas imperiales alemanas privaron a Francia del 75% de su carbón y del 63% de su acero. La Gran Guerra no solo fue una gran carnicería, Pese a que los franceses estaban convencidos de que sería la última de las últimas, solo fue el preludio de otra gran confrontación mucho más extensa y costosa en vidas militares y civiles, como hemos visto a lo largo de la intervención del profesor Philpott, con sus detallados análisis de este conflicto entre el 14 y el 18 y de la industrialización bélica de tanto de Francia y Gran Bretaña en el frente occidental. Al firmarse el armisticio con las humillantes condiciones impuestas a Alemania, se puso la semilla de la próxima gran conflagración mundial, 21 años después, cuando Hitler destacó y desató la Segunda Guerra Mundial. La industrialización de la muerte había llegado a su apogeo. Thank you very much, William, for your excellent presentation and for the excellent answers to the students' questions. Thank you for your participation in the seminar. Thank you.
Okay, let's continue. Introduce our speaker, Francesco Sampieri. He holds a degree in contemporary history and PhD in European history from the University of Verona. Dr. Sampieri was part of the Oceanidis project, an international research program of the maritime history in Europe, and the influence that the maritime element has held on the Dr. Sampieri is officer Naval Reserve and the Italian Navy. So let's welcome Dr. Sampieri. Thank you so much for joining us, and the audience is all yours to begin your presentation.
Thank you so much, Laura Velandia, and thank you so much, David De Caixal. I'm very happy to be here this evening, and I'm ready to start with my PowerPoint presentation about the Regia Marina in the First World War. I have a lot of slides, I'm sorry with you, but it is very important to analyze all the aspects of the Italian naval warfare in the Mediterranean and in the Adriatic Sea during the First World War. Okay, so the first slide is devoted to analysis of the contents of my PowerPoint presentation. I will analyze the Mediterranean and Adriatic Sea before the war, in particular, the geostrategic and geopolitical situation in the Mediterranean and in the Adriatic Sea before the war. Then I will analyze the geostrategic situation in the Adriatic Sea and not advantageous situation for Italy and the first phase of war. Then we will analyze the changement in the naval war of Italy from the battle on sea to the maritime trenches. This is a new word, and I think that this word is very clear to explain the real nature of the naval warfare in the Adriatic Sea. And then the game changer in the Adriatic naval warfare, the battle into the enemy ports. This is a new idea of this was a new idea of the Italian admirals, a very incredible and interesting idea. And then conclusions. So the first slide is devoted to the analysis of the world before First World War. The First World War was a global war due to the European colonial empire. So, despite the war erupted for a crisis in the Europe, more specifically in the Balkans, the war became quickly global. Italy was a colonial empire, the most lethal of the European empires, but the control of Tunisia by France and the control of Libya by Italy was a crowd of disputes between the two nations, the two Latin nations. Italy didn't forget the mugging of Tunisia by France, and France aimed to extend its control on Northern Africa until the British controlled Egypt. During the long peace period from 1870 to 1914, Europe experienced some evolutions in the balance of power, some changements in the balance of power. Between 1817 and 1890, the European balance of power was dominated by the Bismarck's policy of the isolationism of France to keeping the peace in the continent. After the end of the Bismarck age, the European balance of power shifted toward a bipolar opposition between the Triple Alliance and the French-Russian alliance. When England joined the French-Russian alliance, a new bloc of power, the Triple Entente, became a player of the European policy. The two alliances were characterized by stronger rivalries, not only due to the opposite ambitions in the continent, but also due to the rivalries in the colonial expansion. Okay. During the long period between 1870 and 1914, the Italian foreign policy was characterized by a schizophrenic vision. After national unification in 1860-1861 and until the First World War, the potential enemies of the new Italian kingdom were France, this one, and the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburg Empire was a natural enemy of Italy because the two Italian towns of Trento and Trieste were under its control. France was an enemy because its colonial interests, in particular in Tunisia and in Northern Africa, competed with the interest of Italy. Alps protected Italy from a possible ground invasion by France, but the long and undefended coastline was exposed to threats from the west in the Tyrrhenian Sea, east in the Adriatic, and south in the Ionian Sea. If the Italian army had remained in being in Po Valley, in the northern Italy, it could have defeated any enemy that attacked Italy through Alps. Still, the Italian peninsula's coasts were suitable for amphibious landings. To avoid amphibious landings, Italy needed a navy sufficient to command the Tyrrhenian Sea and to destroy enemy transports and their troops on board. For 30 years, from 1870 to 1900, Italian foreign policy focused on the French threat. To counter France, Italy relied on the alliance with the German Empire and the more unnatural alliance with the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1882. This is the date of birth of the Triple Alliance. Afterward, Italy also sought naval support in the Mediterranean from Britain, but without success, leveraging the latter's periodic clashes with France. Italy spent the 30 years between 1882 and 1912 trying to negotiate some naval cooperation with Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Britain to counter France. Even with the Triple Alliance, the Regia Marina remained inferior to the French Navy. The Italian effort to gain naval cooperation by the allied Germans and Austrians was frustrated by the opposition of Berlin and Vienna and by the growing tension between Germany and Britain. So, in case of war, this was the scenarios. I'm sorry because I forget to translate the title in English. This was the scenario of war in the Mediterranean. From Tunisia and from the new naval French base in Bizerte, France could have been able to land its forces on Sicily, the big island in the center of the Mediterranean, and to take the island and to gain the command of the Western Mediterranean. Contemporarily, the France-Russian ally would be engaging against Austrian and Italian fleets in the Eastern Mediterranean, and French naval writers during the last part of 19th century cited repeatedly speculated about landing French troops in Sicily to provoke an uprising of the poor local population against the Italian government. Given that France already had Tunisia, the southern shore of the Sicilian Channel, controlling the northern shore as well, would have meant dominating the Mediterranean. The balance of power in the Western Mediterranean, in the Tyrrhenian Sea, always favored France, which could expect assistance from the Russian fleet in exiting from Bosphorus Straits, and with the superiority against the Italian fleet in the number of warships. The strategic balance became very bad for Italy during the decades of 90s, in the last decade of 19th century, and during the first decade of the 20th century. The growing competition in the North Sea with Germany, the Franco-Russian alliance, the increasing power of the French fleet, and the focus on Suez and the desire to contain Russia in the Black Sea convinced Britain to improve relations with France. So, for Italy, the situation became very bad. Consequently, Italy adopted an ambivalent foreign policy from 1890 to 1914. Italy formally maintained its alliance with Germany and Austro-Hungary, but due to the inattention of its allies, Italy progressively aligned its foreign policy with Britain and France. Between 1896 and 1905, the French-Italian relations improved. Contemporarily, Italy kept to obtain a military commitment of the Triple Alliance in the Mediterranean. Finally, after 20 years of diplomatic efforts, on 5 December 1900, the powers of the Triple Alliance, Italy, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, signed their first naval agreement, and this was a success for Italy. But some days after renewing the Triple Alliance and signing the Naval Convention, Italy signed also an agreement with France on 16th December 1900. The coup of théâtre, the game changer for the Italian foreign policy, was these double agreements with all the powers clashing each other. Why Italy was so ambivalent? Because Italy was in inferior condition against France and in inferior condition against the Austria-Hungarian Empire in the Adriatic. The Triple Alliance signatories renewed their naval convention in June 1913, improving the agreement of 1900. The new agreement was more favorable for Italy. The German and Austro-Hungarian navies agreed to subordinate their forces in the Mediterranean to the Regia Marina in case of war against Russia and France. But Italy wasn't happy for this situation, and so, consequently, in August 1914, when the First World War erupted in Europe, Italy declared its neutrality due to the violation of the alliance terms by Vienna, which went on an offensive war without consulting Rome and rendering the plans moot. So, at the beginning of the First World War, Italy didn't join the Triple Alliance allies, Germany and Austro-Hungarian Empire, into the war against France and Britain and Russia. Although Italy considered France to be the main threat and so focused on defense of the Tyrrhenian Sea, its security also depends on control of the Adriatic Sea. After the conclusion of the Triple Alliance, a cold peace in the Adriatic ensued between the Italian kingdom and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Despite membership in the Triple Alliance and related naval conventions above mentioned, relations between Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire deteriorated progressively during the last part of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, and deteriorated, and these relations deteriorated as disputes in the Balkans. So, planning for a possible naval war in the Adriatic Sea became necessary for Italy. In January 1904 and 1909, the Regia Marina and the Regia Esercito completed, the Italian Royal Navy and the Italian Royal Army completed some studies about joint warfare in the Adriatic Sea and in the northeastern frontiers of Italy. In 1908, after Austro-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, relations between Rome and Vienna deteriorated. During the First Balkan War in 1912 and 1913, a new crisis in Italo-Austro-Hungarian relations arose when Vienna speculated to occupy Scutari and Durazzo in Albania, and the crisis was resolved only with the birth of the Albanian states. Finally, when the First World War erupted, as above remembered, the Italian kingdom occupied Ceseno Bay on the Albanian coast in the October of 1914 and Vlor in the December of 1914. So on 24 May 1915, an year after the beginning of the First World War, Italy chose to join the war, but not with the allies of the Triple Alliance, but with the France, Britain, and Russia. On 24 May 1915, Italy joined the war with the Triple Entente, and the main important strategic objective for Italy was represented by the conquest of Trentino and the occupation of Trento, and by the conquest of Trieste, both towns under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Despite the young Italian kingdom's vulnerability and worsening relations with France, the Italy joined the war against the Triple Alliance. At the opening of the war, the balance between the Italian and Austro-Hungarian fleet was very good for Italy. The number of battleships and the number of torpedoes, boats, and destroyers was very similar. But the geostrategic condition for Italy in the Adriatic Sea wasn't favorable to Italy. The naval base in Venice, in the northern Italy, was adequate only for torpedo boats and submarines, while Brindisi in the southern Italy was exposed to blockade. In case of the Austro-Hungarian conquest of Venice in the northern, the northern Adriatic would have completely fallen in the Austro-Hungarian hands. Ancona, in the middle of eastern coast of Italy, on the Adriatic Sea, could host only temporarily main forces, but Ancona was without links with or connection with the Italian main strategic centers. Between Venice and Ancona, there was the secondary base of Porto Corsini that could recover only little boats and motor torpedo boats. In the southern Italy, Bari, at north of Brindisi, was only a commercial port. The Austro-Hungarian fleet owned very impressive and very effective naval bases in the eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea. The main naval base for the Austro-Hungarian fleet was Pola, and the main secondary base was Trieste. Sebenik, in the middle of Dalmatia region, in the middle of Adriatic, was another important base for torpedo boats and destroyers. And the naval base of Kotor in the southern region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was another important base for torpedo boats and destroyers. So the geostrategic condition in the Adriatic Sea was unbalanced and was in favor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. From Pola, in particular, the Austro-Hungarian Navy could threaten the two Italian naval bases of Venice in the lagoon and Ancona in the upper sector of the Adriatic Sea. From Pola, the Austro-Hungarian Navy could project its power against the Italian coast, avoiding the reaction of the Regia Marina. Pola controlled also the slots from and to Venice and could protect the two main merchant ports of Trieste and this one and Fiume. Regarding the other Austro-Hungarian main naval base, the naval base of Cattaro in the southern region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Serbian and Montenegrin revanchism worried the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Montenegrin controlled the Mount Lovćen overlooking Kotor Bay, and from the Mount Lovćen, the Montenegrin army could threat the Austrian naval base of Kotor. In the Italian naval view, the Austro-Hungarian naval base at Kotor was a deadly threat. So Italy supported Serbia against Vienna. Brindisi, as above noted, was the only Italian naval base in the southern Adriatic usable to close the Otranto Channel. The Otranto Channel is the strait in the southern gate of the Adriatic Sea. Brindisi could host only light cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, and so the main bulk of the Italian fleet was based in Taranto naval bases in the Gulf of Taranto in the Ionian Seas, relatively far from the Otranto channels. Taranto naval base in the Ionian Sea was the main naval base for the Italian fleet, but it was peripheric for the naval warfare in the Adriatic. So during the entire war, the Regia Marina performed not only naval fights against the enemy naval fleet, but also the Italian Navy was able to shape the maritime battlefield, building defensive and offensive improvements along the Italian eastern coast on Adriatic. During the war, the Regia Marina spent about 90 million lire, 90 million lire to adapt its naval bases to new requirements. In particular, works were directed to the adaptation of the old naval bases, providing these naval bases with excavation, building new breakwaters, piers, dry docks, slipways, and other tools for the naval fleet. Very important works were completed in the Venetian lagoon with the excavation of a new canal, this one in this brown color, into the lagoon and through the lagoon. This new canal connected the sea with the naval base in the ancient shipyard, in the ancient Arsenale in Venice. Outside the ancient Arsenale, but very close to the old factories, during 1915, the Italians completed a new dry dock for the dreadnoughts of the fleet. The name of this new dry dock was Prince of Piedmont. During the entire war, the Italians completed also more very impressive works along the Venetian littoral from the Po River to the Isonzo River, along the entire coast of the Venetian land. The goal was the building of an internal main waterway for the logistical sustain to the land forces, to the Regio Esercito, committed in the northeastern frontier in the point of contact represented by the Isonzo River. These waterways were very important for the sustainment of the Italian Royal Army and for the land battles in the Venetian region. Using these waterways, supplies and soldiers were relatively not exposed to the Austro-Hungarian naval bombings. The war changed some of the ideas and the plans written before the war. On 26 April 1915, Italy joined the Triple Entente, and on 24 May 1915, Italy joined the war. But on 10th May 1915, the Regia Marina signed a naval agreement with the new Allied navies. The agreement gave to the Italians the initiative and the complete direction of the naval warfare in the Adriatic. The Regia Marina obtained a British naval division composed by 4 battleships and 4 light cruisers and 12 destroyers. The French Navy guaranteed the support of numerous torpedoes, boats, submarines, and minesweepers to close the Austro-Hungarian Navy into the Adriatic. Despite the Allied aid, the Italian geostrategic disadvantage in the Adriatic remained evident for all the entire war, and the Austro-Hungarians were free to operate without contrast in the Adriatic. The first commander-in-chief of the Italian naval war in the Mediterranean and in the Adriatic was the Vice Admiral Luigi Savoia, Duke of Abruzzi. Luigi di Savoia, Duke of Abruzzi, was the father of a strategy, of an ineffective strategy in the first month of war. The Italian naval strategy elaborated by the Duke of Abruzzi was based on the presence of the scouting forces, Allied scouting forces at Brindisi, and on a presence of a fleeting being at Taranto, and a research of decisive battle with aggressive patrols. According to the idea of Duke of Abruzzi, escorting forces operating in the Adriatic Sea would have been able to provoke the Austro-Hungarian Navy and to engage this enemy fleet in a main battle in which the bulk of the Italian fleet and the bulk of Allied fleets in the Ionian Sea would have superior in number against the Austro-Hungarian fleet. So the Duke of Abruzzi improved the coastal defenses of the Eastern Adriatic with mines and torpedo boats. The red signs, the red lines in this slide were related to the minefield and in the Adriatic. And finally, the Duke of Abruzzi believed in the possibility to attack the enemy's warships with insidious means, represented only by torpedo boats and mines. But the first phase of war was in favor of the Austro-Hungarians. On 24th May 1915, the Austro-Hungarian Navy was able to conduct the bombing of Ancona. This bombing provoked the destruction of naval signals, the damage of some foreign merchant ships, and the kill of 75 people, civilians. But this bombing was also a violation of the 9th Convention of Hague, because Ancona was declared in December 1914 an open town. To protect the Italian eastern coast on the Adriatic and to defend the Italian coastline, the Regia Marina introduced in service the armed train, 10-12 armed trains, running alongside the Adriatic coast and acting as mobile coastal defenses. On 3rd February 1916, the armed trains were able to impede the naval bombing of Ortona, and on 15 February, the armed trains avoided an aerial attack against Rimini and other Italian towns. During the war, the coastal defense was improved not only with the armed trains, but also with 119 coastal batteries for a total of 542 medium caliber guns and other 534 batteries with a total of 702 guns were installed on the Tyrrhenian coasts during the war. When we talk about the armed trains of the Italian Regia Marina, we talk about armed trains with naval artilleries. On board the train, we can find anti-ship gun, very important anti-ship gun, 152 millimeters and 120 millimeters anti-ship guns, machine guns, and a crew of 5 officers, 10, 15 petty officers, and until 70 seamen. But the first months of naval warfare in the Adriatic were characterized by naval losses for the Italian Navy. On June 1915, outside Venice, the submarine Medusa was sunk. In May, at the end of May of 1915, outside Trieste, was the destroyer Turbine. The destroyer Turbine was destroyed, and the same situation occurred for other warships in the Upper Adriatic. So the aggressive strategy of the commander-in-chief, Duke of Abruzzi, couldn't applied in the very unfavorable geostrategic condition of the Adriatic Sea. So at the end of 1915, the strategy selected by the Duke of Abruzzi was clearly failed. Despite audacious actions against the enemy's coasts, naval bombing, aggressive patrols, the Austro-Hungarian Navy still refused the decisive battle, pivoting its geostrategic advantage and selecting a fleeting strategy. During the first months of war, the Regia Marina had lost some important and modern warships, such as 2 modern cruisers, Garibaldi and Amalfi, and other minor warships, such as submarines, torpedo boats, or destroyers. The Regia Marina was shocked by the internal divisions among admirals. The Minister of the Navy, Vice Admiral Leone Viale, resigned on 24 September 1915. The Chief of Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Paolo Taon di Revel, in a fight with the Admiral Duke of Abruzzi, resigned on 12 October 1915. And finally, the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Duke of Abruzzi, was heavily criticized. Taon di Revel asked the office of Commander-in-Chief of the Venice and of the Maritime Northeastern Front, becoming the pivot of the Italian strategy in the Upper Adriatic. During the first months of war, numerous lacks emerged in the Italian conduct of naval warfare. The first one was the lack of adequate escort and insidious ships, such as torpedo boats and destroyers. The second one was the lack of aeronaval cooperation, and the third one was the lack of secrecy for the naval operation, as demonstrated by the sabotages of the Leonardo da Vinci dreadnought. Between middle October 1915 and April 1916, the Italians performed very important mission in support to the Serbian army engaged in the fight with the Austro-Hungarian army in the Balkans region. Italian amphibious landing at Valona were very important to reinforce the strategic key point of Valona, to close the Adriatic Sea in the south, and to support military operation of the Serbian army in the Balkans. This is the main route of the Italian supplies for the Serbian army in the Albania, and this is the main route for the Italian support to the Serbian army and the Greek army to Salonika. This is a graphic about the relevance of the Italian role in the support to the Serbian army. in comparison with the British and the French role. And on 29th December 1915, there was the only major naval battle of the first year of the naval warfare in the Adriatic. An Austro-Hungarian raider force based on the scout vessel Helgoland and on a flotilla of 5 destroyers bombed the Albanian port of Durazzo, sinking a Greek freighter. The reaction of coastal batteries pushed into the mines the Austro-Hungarian warships, provoking the loss of one of the 5 destroyers. The Austrians ordered the exit of their battle fleet anchored at Kotor. Only an armored cruiser, one escort, 4 torpedo boats, and other little boats were able to join the raider force outside the Durazzo ports. The Italian and Allied forces joined the battle and were able to sink 2 Austro-Hungarian destroyers and to damage the scout vessel Helgoland and the destroyers Balaton, Xepel, and Tatra. The Italian scouting vessel Bixio was targeted by the Austro-Hungarian ships, and the day was clearly in favor to the Allies. 2 enemy destroyers were sunk and 2 heavily were damaged, and 2 destroyers, were heavily damaged. But this battle wasn't the hoped decisive naval battle required by the Duke of Abruzzi. So the Duke of Abruzzi was very frustrated in its strategy, and the Battle of 29th December 1915 demonstrated the lack of coordination among warships, aircraft, and submarines. During 1916, the naval warfare in the Adriatic became a guerrilla warfare. This guerrilla warfare was possible only due to the adoption of a lot of torpedo boats and a lot of new weapons and tools, such as MAS, motoscafo antisommergibile, or motor torpedo boat, quick motor torpedo boat. The Admiral Taon di Revel, the father of these new weapons, declared, "We found the most decisive weapons for this guerrilla naval warfare. This new weapon is well adapted to the courage of our seamen." So, on 7th February 1917, due to the clash between the Italian admirals and due to the pressure of the Allies, the Duke of Abruzzi, in the left corner of this slide, resigned, and the commander-in-chief was assigned to Admiral Paolo Taon di Revel on the right side of this slide. Admiral Taon di Revel decided to maintain the strategy of the fleeting being at Taranto, but he supported the development of insidious vessels such as the MAS and the development of the naval aviation. So the naval warfare in the Adriatic became a more important naval guerrilla warfare. This new form of war was derived by the geographical constraints, the disadvantage of the Italian geostrategic situation in the Adriatic coast, and by the adoption of new military means, as torpedo boats, mines, MAS, submarines, aircraft. The MAS was the game changer of the Italian naval warfare in the Adriatic. the mass must conduct insidious actions into the enemy ports and against the enemy warships along the eastern Adriatic coast, acting in any favorable condition to hit the Austro-Hungarian fleet. In this slide, we can appreciate the increasing number of mass delivered to the Regia Marina, to the Italian Navy during the war. And we can identify three main types of mass. The type A, the more little mass, and the type B and C. This one is the most important type of mass, and this is an American design, an American project. Sorry, because, okay. The adoption of mass pushed the development of new naval bases for this new warship. Between 1916 and 1918, the Regia Marina developed new naval bases alongside the eastern coast, but also the western coast of the peninsula. In particular, in the northeastern Adriatic, the mass were able to perform missions against Trieste, against Pola, against the islands of the eastern Adriatic coast into the Dalmatian region. And departing from Ancona, the Italian mass was able to hit the Dalmatian coast, the central Dalmatian coast, and departing from Brindisi, the Italian mass was able to operate until the Albanian coast. With the intent to bottle the and to block the Austro-Hungarian and German submarines operating from the naval base of Kotor, the Allies completed an underwater barrier in the southern Adriatic, closing the Otranto Channel. The Otranto Channel is characterized by the width of 70 kilometers. Despite an impressive number of tools employed to perform this naval barrage, between July 1916 and February 1918, the German and Austrian submarines were able to sink the major part of the Allied and neutral merchant ships in the Mediterranean. So the German and Austrian submarines were able to trespass the Otranto barrage and to operate in the Mediterranean. On September 1918, the Allied navies aligned in the Otranto Channel an impressive naval forces based on 31 destroyers, 4 torpedo boats, 6 sloops, 52 fishing vessels converted in minesweeper, and 101 drifters, 41 little boats, and 36 anti-submarine vessels from the US Navy. During the entire war, 10 German submarines were sunk into or outside Pola, Trieste, Fiume, and Kotor Austrian naval bases. After 28 October 1918, with the abandon of these bases, only 4 German submarines and 8 Austro-Hungarian submarines were sunk in the Adriatic and in the Otranto Channel. The Otranto barrage was a very impressive barrage and barrier in the southern Adriatic, and the Austro-Hungarian performed a series of missions against this barrage. 5 missions in the 1915, 9 missions during 1916 and 10 missions during 1917. The results of these missions were very modest, and during a mission of 1918, the Austro-Hungarian battleship Istvan was torpedoed by an Italian mass outside the island of Bermuda. The effectiveness of the Otranto's barrage against the surface ships was demonstrated by the naval battle of 15 May 1917. In this occasion, some Austro-Hungarian scouting ships attacked the drifters at 10 miles from Otranto, and contemporarily, some destroyers raided the merchant ships close to Valona. Despite the sunk of one freighter and some drifters, the Austro-Hungarian warships were attacked by the bulk of the Allied naval forces steaming from Taranto, and 3 Austro-Hungarian scouting ships were heavily damaged. In 1918 and 1917, the Italians were able to gain victories against the Austro-Hungarian fleet. During about 18 months of war, the Regia Marina suffered heavy losses, but it was able to develop new tools and weapons to rebalance the naval warfare in the Adriatic. To rebalance the naval warfare, Admiral Taon di Revel encouraged the actions with the mass and with the naval aviation. On 9th December 1917, the port of Trieste was attacked by the mass, and this action convinced the Austro-Hungarian Navy to transfer its warships into Pola. On 10th June 1918 at Bermuda, the mass of Luigi Rizzo was able to stop the Austro-Hungarian battleships exiting from Pola and directed to the Otranto barrage with the aim to attack this barrage. On 16 November 1917, an effective daily attack, 1917, yes, an effective daily attack of mass against the Vin squadron that was bombing Cortellazzo was characterized by the sinking of the Vin. In only 6 months, from the sinking of Vin to the sinking of St. Istvan, Luigi Rizzo was able to sink 25,000 tons of enemy warships, gaining the admiration of the Allied admirals, such as the British Admiral Beatty. This is a slide demonstrating the route of the mass during the bite and the battle of 9-10 December 1917 and the attack against the Baia of Muggia with the sinking of Vin. This is a picture of the sinking of Vin, and this is another slide in which we can appreciate the action of Bucari. The action of Bucari was performed on February of 1918 by the mass and by the Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. On 10th February 1918, the Italians were able to obtain the vengeance of Lissa. On board Mass 196, the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio and Luigi Rizzo attacked the Austro-Hungarian ships in the Bucari base, but without sinking of the enemy ships. Gabriele D'Annunzio abandoned 3 bottles containing a message for the Austro-Hungarian. This message was characterized by the idea of the vengeance of the naval battle of Lissa in 1866. On 10th June 1918, the Luigi Rizzo with the Mass 15 and midshipman Aonzo were able to attack the Austro-Hungarian fleet at Premuda Island, and during this attack, the Italian mass were able to sink the battleship St. Istvan. This is a picture of the sinking of the battleship St. Istvan. Okay. With the aim to attack the enemy ports, during the first half of 1917, the Svan shipyard, Svan is acronym for Società Veneziana Automobili Navali, Venetian factory for little boats. This is the translation in English. The Svan shipyard was charged by the Admiral Count de Revel to design a tool that could trespass the floating barriers protecting the naval base of Pola. The project selected was represented by 4 jumping boats. This is the jumping. These were the jumping boats. The name of the jumping boats were Grillo, Cavalletta, Locusta, and Pulce, and all these jumping boats were completed in March 1918. The only attack performed by these boats were conducted on 14 May 1918. The Grillo was able to trespass the external barriers of Pola and to enter into the port, but the Italian seamen were discovered and by the Austro-Hungarian sentinels, and they were captured. But before they surrendered, they were able to sink the secret jumping boat. On 2nd October 1918, due to the Allied pressures, an Italian division of armored cruisers with the protection of Dreadnought Dante Alighieri and with the aid of some British cruisers and an escort of US anti-submarine warships, bombed the Austro-Hungarian naval base at Durazzo, occupied by the Austro-Hungarian in the previous month. The Allied warships opened the fire from a distance of 12 kilometers, and they destroyed depots and equipments. The Allied warships were able to sink the steamship Istanbul and some Austrian landing crafts, and damaged heavily the steamship Graz. The Austro-Hungarian Navy renounced to intercept the Allied formation, and this was another forgotten, another lost occasion to fight the decisive battle in the southern Adriatic. 12 days after the attack against Durazzo, the Italians occupied Durazzo and advanced with the army until San Giovanni di Medua and Dulcineo in the Albanian region. The attack against the Pola naval base was performed between 31st October and 1st November 1918 by a new underwater weapon developed by the Italians. This new weapon was the miniata in Italian language. It was a modified torpedo driven by 2 frogmen, and it was designed by Lieutenant Rossetti. During the night between 31st October and 1st November 1918, the Miniata was able to sink the battleship Viribus Unitis and the steamship Vien. The Miniata delivered a warhead of 175 kilos of TNT, able to detonate after 6 hours. Despite this success, the war was very close to the end. During the war, Italy was sustained by the supplies from the North America. The Northern American supplies was very impressive for the sustainment of Italy. 49 millions of tons of goods and supplies were directed to Italy by the Northern America through the Atlantic Ocean, and other 2 millions of supplies were directed to Italy through the Suez Canal. To increase the protection of the Italian ports, the Italian Navy was able to build new barriers for the protection of the main ports of the Italy in the western coast, and to develop new escort and scouting ships for the protection of the Tyrrhenian convoys by the Tyrrhenian convoys. Avoid a very heavy losses by the German and performed by the German and Austro-Hungarian submarines. The U-boat operated in Adriatic, and during the 1917, they were able to sink a very impressive number of merchant ships in the Tyrrhenian Sea and in the central Mediterranean. The Regia Marina fought the war also in the land domain. The Regia Marina developed monitors and floating guns for the littoral warfare in the northeastern region of Italy. In particular, until 1917, the monitors of during the war, the Italian Royal Navy was able to perform missions in the littoral area and of the littoral warfare. In particular, in the northeastern region of the Italian kingdom, in the upper Adriatic. The Regia Marina developed some monitors and floating batteries for the sustainment of the Regio Esercito, Italian Royal Army in the northeastern frontier. Until the Caporetto defeat, the Italian Royal Army was able to advance also in the littoral region of the Venetian land until the Isonzo River, and the Italian Royal Navy was able to guarantee the sustain from the sea with monitors and floating batteries. The Monfalcone battle on 1916 was heavily influenced by the availability of the monitors and floating batteries of the Italian Navy, but from the withdrawal of Caporetto in 1917, the main task of the Regia Marina in the northeastern region of the Adriatic Sea was the defense of Venice. The Regia Marina performed some missions for the defense of the Venetian littorals and for the protection of the Italian Regio Esercito after the Caporetto defeat. The withdrawal from the Monfalcone and Grado were guaranteed by the support of the monitors and floating batteries of the Regia Marina. In this slide, you can appreciate, you can identify the main battlefield in the northeastern region in the Venetian land after the withdrawal of Caporetto. In this area operated the seamen and marines of the Italian Regia Marina, and they were able to perform counterattack against the Austrian positions in the Venetian land. This is a map of the war regarding the different contact line of contact between Italians in blue and Austro-Hungarians in the red. And this is the scheme of the counterattack in the spring of 1918. During the war, many guns and artilleries of the Regia Marina was transferred to the land front. In particular, the guns of medium and little caliber. And during the war, the Italian guns were used, of the Regia Marina, were used also for the empowerment and the improving of the coastal defense along the Italian eastern coastline. This is a picture in which we can identify some Italian seamen engaged in an action of fire with the naval guns on the land front. And this is a picture of a floating battery, and this is the little train for the sustainment of the land batteries in the Venetian land front. And this is a picture about the protection of the Church of San Marco in the San Marco Square in Venice. And this is a picture about the protection of the bronze horses in the face of the San Marco Church. Another picture about the protection with sandbags for the monuments of the Venice and the San Marco Church. So after the war, for the remembrance of the role of the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, in the defense of Venice, during August 1918 and again in the April 1919, the Venice town decided to give to the Italian Marines the name of San Marco in remembrance of the courageous defense of Venice. Today, when the Italian Marines are deployed not only in Italy, but also outside Italy, the flag is the flag of Italy, the flag of these little brigades of Marines is the flag of Italy, but also the flag of the ancient Republic of Venice. And I'm a Venetian, and for me it is very important to remember that. During the war, the Italian Navy developed some interesting projects about and tools for the aerial dimension of the modern warfare, aircrafts, hydroplanes, and airships. In particular, this is the badge of the Italian naval aviation during the First World War, and this is the motto of the Italian naval aviation during the First World War and today. Sufficit animus, the courage is enough. The Italian naval aviation operated from the main bases in the Adriatic coast, and in particular in the area of Venice. in the left side of this slide, you can appreciate the naval base of the naval base for hydroplanes, sorry, in the Sant'Andrea in Venice Lagoon. And in this slide, we can appreciate the increasing and improving of the naval bases of the aerial naval bases of the Italian Navy during the war. This is the development of the naval aviation during the war. This is the required aircraft, and this is the number of delivered aircraft. And this is the impressive number of the development and delivery of aircraft to the Navy during the First World War. But the Italian Navy operated also with airships during the wars, in particular in the first months of the war, and with seaplanes and with seaplanes tender ship as Elba. The Italian naval aviation obtained also heavy bombers, the Caproni heavy bombers, for the bombing of the enemy naval bases in the Dalmatian coast, and performed during the entire war a very impressive number of missions, not only bombing missions, but also recognition and exploration missions. This is an aerial view of the main naval air naval base of Venice in St. Andrew. And this is a very interesting picture that I found in the National Archive of the Italian Navy, with the hangars and with the Austrian captured aircraft then delivered to the Italian Navy. This is a picture with the King of Italy and the Allied officer at Venetian St. Andrews Air Base, and this is the Macchi L5, the most important seaplane of the Italian Navy during the First World War. Conclusions. The First World War demonstrated the relevance of the geographical and geostrategic constraints. The Italian Navy was in disadvantageous conditions for all the entire war in the Adriatic Sea. The First World War in the Adriatic demonstrated also the effectiveness of sea denial and the lack of the command of the sea. Nothing between the belligerents in the Adriatic Sea was able to gain the command of the sea in the Adriatic. And the First World War in the Adriatic Sea demonstrated also the relevance of new strategies, new weapons, and new tools, such as the weapons and tools developed by the Italians. The First World War demonstrated also the relevance of the technological innovation during the war, in particular in all the domains of the modern warfare, in the aerial domain with aircraft, airships, bombers, and seaplanes, in the land domain with the employment of naval assets for the land warfare, and in the sea with the development of the underwater insidious tools and insidious weapons. Finally, the First World War demonstrated the complex multi-domain warfare in the maritime environment. In my opinion, the First World War in Adriatic represented the beginning of the modern multi-domain warfare, an embryo of the multi-domain warfare in the maritime environment. So I'm sorry again for the bad connect. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your participation and giving the audience such an incredible and complete topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So during the presentation, we received several questions in the chat from the audience that are from different countries. So we will try to answer one of them. And I would like to hand over to David to get you started with some questions from the public. David, ¿qué te parece si iniciamos con nuestra sección de preguntas que van dirigidas para Francesco?
Muchas gracias, Laura. Sí, hemos recibido algunas preguntas por parte de nuestros alumnos. La primera de ellas dice lo siguiente. Durante la Gran Guerra, la Regia Marina puso sus mayores esfuerzos en el mar Adriático, luchando contra la Armada austrohúngara. La campaña adriática resultante de la Primera Guerra Mundial consistió principalmente en bombardeos costeros austrohúngaros de la costa adriática de Italia y de una guerra submarina alemana austrohúngara de mayor alcance en el Mediterráneo. ¿Hubo alguna planificación por parte de la Regia Marina para enfrentarse a mar abierto con la flota austrohúngara y buscar quizá una batalla naval en el Mediterráneo al estilo de Jutlandia?
Yes, my answer is certainly yes, but it is very important to remember that the Austro-Hungarian fleet refused to exit from the Adriatic Sea. I think that in case of exit of the Austro-Hungarian fleet from the main bases of Pola and Kotor, the Austro-Hungarian fleet would have been completely defeated by the Allied navies, because the Austro-Hungarian fleet was inferior in number and in power to the Allied navies. The Italian Navy, before the war, elaborated some strategic scenarios about a decisive battle against the Austro-Hungarian fleet. But these strategic scenarios were all directed, all conceived about a main battle in the Mediterranean or in the Ionian Sea, not in the Adriatic Sea. Why? Because in the Adriatic Sea, the geostrategic situation is favorable only for the Austrian due to the number of islands in the hands of Austrian and the coastline and the presence of the relevant naval bases in the eastern coast of Adriatic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sampieri. Tenemos una segunda pregunta por parte de la audiencia. David, tenemos una siguiente por parte de otro alumno.
Exacto, dice así, ¿podemos decir que las fuerzas aliadas se limitaron solamente a bloquear a las marinas alemanas austrohúngaras en el Adriático?
Okay, yes, the main task of the Allied forces was the blockade of the Austro-Hungarian fleet in the southern Adriatic, and in particular with the mentioned barrage in the Otranto Channel. But it is important to remember also the employment and the use of Allied submarines in the Adriatic and the very important fight in the Adriatic Sea between the Allied submarines and the German and Austro-Hungarian submarines during the entire war. The main task certainly was for the Allied Navy was the blockade of the Austro-Hungarian fleet, but I want to remember the great relevance of the employment of the submarines, Allied submarines in the Adriatic.
Thank you, Dr. Sampieri. Vamos con una última pregunta para no cambiar, digamos, el horario que tenemos para el día de hoy. Vamos con una siguiente pregunta.
I'm sorry for my delay.
Don't worry.
I'm very long in my PowerPoint presentation.
La última pregunta para nuestro invitado, el profesor Francesco Sampieri, es la siguiente. En la última parte de la guerra, la Regia Marina desarrolló nuevas armas, los barcos más, que también nos ha detallado el profesor Sampieri en su ponencia, que hundieron el acorazado austrohúngaro SMS Zen István en el mar Adriático el 10 de junio de 1918 y un tipo temprano de torpedo humano, el Mignata, que entró en el puerto de Pula y hundió al buque insignia austrohúngaro SMS Viribus Unitis el 9 de noviembre de 1918. poco después de que toda la armada austrohúngara fuera entregada al recién fundado Estado neutral de eslovenos, croatas y serbios. ¿Crees que este nuevo sistema de armas desarrollado por la Regia Marina hubiera sido más efectivo utilizado en grandes operaciones contra los puertos austrohúngaros para hundir la flota enemiga?
Yes, I think that the Mignata in particular, not only the mass, but the Mignata was a very impressive and very interesting new weapon. But in my opinion, it was very poor and very unemployed during the First World War. But it is important to remember that from Mignata derived the maiali, pigs in English language of Second World War, of World War II, employed by the Italians in the attack against the British fleet in Alexandria, and other insidious tools used during the World War II. So the Mignata was very important, but it was very poor relevant for the balance of war, because it was delivered only in the last months of the war, and it can perform only one attack. And but this tool was very important for the development of the Italian insidious weapons during the 30s in particular, and during the World War II.
So excellent answer, Dr. Pierre, and thank you very much for your participation in the World War I seminar. Thank you. Thank you for all.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind invitation, and I hope that in the future there will be other occasions for a collaboration with INISEG and your very interesting activities.
Thank you, Dr. Sampieri. So I would
You're
like
welcome.
to give the floor to David to give a brief summary of what we've seen in the presentation.
Muchas
David.
gracias. Sí, muchas gracias, Laura. Nada, desde INISEG queríamos agradecer al profesor Francesco Sampieri, profesor de Estudios Estratégicos del Instituto de Estudios Militares y Marítimos de Venecia, su participación en este seminario sobre la Primera Guerra Mundial, y felicitarle por su magnífica ponencia sobre los aspectos innovadores de la conducta estratégica de la Regia Marina en la Gran Guerra entre 1914 y 1918. El profesor Sampieri nos ha ido detallando y analizando la situación previa de la guerra en el Mediterráneo, la situación estratégica en el Adriático y las fases de la guerra, entre otros temas muy interesantes que han ido analizando a lo largo de su excelente ponencia. La Armada, recordemos, la Armada italiana contaba en el inicio del conflicto con un total de 498.000 toneladas frente a las 372.000 de la austrohúngara, la sexta del mundo en tamaño. En la parte oriental del país tenía 3 bases navales, como muy bien ha ido explicando el profesor Sampieri, la de Tarento, Brindisi y Venecia. Por su parte, los austrohúngaros gozaban de esa ventaja fundamental, la estrechez del Adriático, que les permitía cometer rápidas incursiones en la indefensa costa italiana desde sus bases en Trieste, Pola y Cataro, como también nos ha ido detallando el profesor Sampieri a lo largo de toda la ponencia, sin que evidentemente ese enemigo tuviese tiempo para poder reaccionar con sus grandes navíos. Según lo previsto en la Convención Naval del 10 de mayo, pues se adjuntaba ese texto principal del Tratado de Londres, donde el Reino Unido aportaba a la defensa de Italia 4 acorazados y otros tantos cruceros ligeros, y Francia también unos 12 contratorpederos, 8 torpederos, 9 submarinos, una escuadrilla de hidroaviones, un dragaminas y un acorazado antiguo. En total, la ayuda naval franco-británica equivalía casi al tamaño de la flota austrohúngara. Con lo cual, la mejora de esa situación en el mar llegó finalmente para los italianos en 1916, dado que los austrohúngaros continuaban la guerra submarina en el Adriático, hundiendo tantos buques mercantes como de la Armada, que evidentemente los italianos decidieron producir un nuevo barco ligero y rápido, diseñado para las incursiones rápidas, como muy bien nos ha detallado el profesor Sampieri, refiriéndose al MAS, el motoscafo armato silurante, una especie de lancha torpedera. En 1917 llegarían algunos reveses para la Armada italiana, que perdió unos 47 buques antisubmarinos. Como consecuencia de esa derrota, la Marina Militares hubo de ceder el mando de las operaciones antisubmarinas en el Adriático a los británicos. En el Mediterráneo, en general, la participación italiana en la protección del transporte fue casi nula. Los aliados lograron reducir las pérdidas a partir de mayo de 1918 mediante diversos sistemas, pero fueron franceses, británicos y norteamericanos los que también aplicaron sin apenas esa colaborazione. E con ello, e para poner punto final, grazie mille per la presentazione, Francesco, è stato eccellente, con ottima informazione e risposte alle domande dei nostri studenti. Thank you.
Grazie a voi e complimenti per l'italiano.
Grazie.
Eccellente.
Gracias. To continue, let's introduce our next speaker, Andrew Lambert. He is a law professor of the Naval History in the Department of the War Studies and King's College. After completing research in the department, he taught at Bristol Polytechnic, now the University of West of England, the Royal Naval Staff College, and the Royal Military Academy. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and also director of the London Naval Union, hosting the department. So let's welcome Professor Andrew. It's so good to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us in this event. And the audience is all yours to start and you begin your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be with you today. And I look forward to running through one of the great battles of history at the middle of the First World War. What I want to do is to set up the battle, to explain why the British and Germans are fighting before we get into the business of battle. So before the First World War, there is a major arms race between Britain and Germany in naval armaments. They both build enormous battle fleets at very great cost. And there is an assumption in Britain, in Germany, and indeed across most of the world, that these battles will be fought, that the winner will win the great conflict for world empire, much as Alfred Thayer Mahan had said in his book about the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, that the decisive battles fought at sea settle the war. I think today we know better than that. Decisive battles fought at sea decide who controls the sea, rather than the land. So let's go back a little way. How decisive was the Battle of Trafalgar? Well, in all honesty, not very. In 1805, Nelson defeats the fleets of France and Spain and creates a heroic legend. But the wars against Napoleon don't finally end for another 10 years. So we cannot call Trafalgar a decisive battle. It settles who rules the sea, but the ruler of Europe will be Napoleon for a very long time. So we have to be very careful. We don't expect that the Battle of Jutland is going to change the history of the world, whoever wins it. It's going to be significant, but it is not going to be decisive. Land battles can be decisive. Waterloo in 1815, but naval battles rarely settle anything. The First World War at sea is about control of communications. That will be decisive. The ability to move men, materials, resources, food on a global strategic level is going to determine the outcome of both world wars. The power that commands the ocean will be able to concentrate and apply power wherever it likes. The powers that have no control of the sea have to sit and wait to be attacked from the sea by their enemies. And the Central Powers in the First World War will not be able to escape Europe. It's fair to say that in 1914-18, Britain fights a global war. Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire fight European local wars, and they are overwhelmed by global resources. Long before the First World War, the British had global communications wrapped up. Here is a graphic emphasizing Britain's control of the seas, the spread of its cruiser fleet, and its ability, using newly developed Marconi wireless systems, to project command and control around the world. The British are already capable of controlling the Atlantic using radio by 1910. By 1914, their control stretches further. It's going to become a global network, which is also emphasized in the first major battle of the First World War at sea, the Battle of the Falkland Islands in December 1914. The only German significant force outside the North Sea is intercepted as it approaches the Falkland Islands to attack British communication systems, in this case a radio net, and they are destroyed. That is the end of the First World War. The First World War is now a European war in which Britain and her allies are able to funnel resources into the European theatre. And that's about command of communications. The British dominate the ocean with warships and with merchant ships. Britain is going to depend on massive resource flows from outside Europe to feed its armies, to build up its armies with non-European manpower, and to deliver effect. All of this hinges around the Grand Fleet, Britain's primary battleship force, commanded by this man, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. It's based in Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, just to the north of Scotland. Not a particularly hospitable anchorage in the middle of winter, cold, wet and windy. But this controls the northern axis of the North Sea. The North Sea goes either around the north of England or past the south of England. The main threat is in the north, and it means the Germans cannot escape from the North Sea with their warships or their merchant vessels without fighting through British fleets, which command both ends of the North Sea. It is also beautifully placed because most German destroyers do not have the endurance to steam all the way to Scapa Flow, fight a battle, and return home. So the Germans literally cannot challenge the Royal Navy's control of the North Sea. They don't have the right ships. And beyond that, they don't have a single naval base they could go to outside the North Sea and the Baltic. So even if they left the North Sea, they would never return. The British used this naval dominance to block Germany's imports of resources, of fuel, of food, but even German reserve soldiers coming back from overseas positions were intercepted and detained by the Royal Navy. So the Royal Navy is locking down the German economy, undermining its ability to function at a critical time, because the Germans have just mobilized all of their agricultural labor force into the army on the expectation that the war will be over by Christmas and they can send their soldiers back to Germany to plant the crops. Without those soldiers, they cannot plant next year's crops. They cannot raise next year's animals. They cannot generate the foodstuffs they're going to need to wage war. They want to buy it on the international market. The British block this. So the British are challenging the Germans to come out, to challenge the blockade, to fight a battle on Britain's terms. The British Grand Fleet is larger than the German fleet by a ratio of 4 to 3, and by the time we get to Jutland, it's 3 to 2. So the British are building more ships. They have more ships. Their ships are bigger, they're generally faster, and they have bigger guns. The German ships are strongly built, not as fast or as powerful as the British ships. So there's, even in this battle, a trade-off between two very different concepts of naval warfare: the highly aggressive firepower of the Royal Navy and the more defensive stance that the Germans are taking. For the Germans, the key threat from the sea is that the British will occupy the Baltic and cut their trade with Sweden, which is a critical element in their war economy. As you know, Britain is allied to Russia, which has a powerful fleet in the Baltic, operating out of what is now the Baltic states. And a combination of British and Russian sea power in the Baltic would have defeated Germany very quickly. So when the British think about persuading the Germans to fight, it is by putting pressure on the Baltic, not anywhere else. Here is the German High Command. The Admiral Reinhard Scheer, who took over command of the High Seas Fleet in 1916. This is the picture that he put in the frontispiece of his memoirs, and it sums him up perfectly. He's not paying any attention to anybody else. He's looking straight ahead with his chin pointing into the far distance. Very confident, aggressive, talented officer with a good command over his fleet, but not somebody who's thought clearly through the strategic ramifications of some of his actions. A worthy opponent, but perhaps not a great one. Grand Fleet at sea. Most of these ships burn coal. They give off enormous amounts of smoke when they're traveling at high speed. Some of them are now oil burning, particularly the smaller ships and the newest British battleships. But most of the ships in this battle burn coal. This matters because the 31st of May, 1916 is a day with low, overcast, cloudy conditions in the North Sea. Normally, the North Sea in the middle of summer is bright and airy, but on this day it is low, thick cloud, quite unpleasant and rather dismal weather. This has a big impact on the battle. The range of visibility is around 12,000 meters maximum. This is less than half the actual range of the heavy guns on Britain's ships. You cannot see the horizon, but your guns could fire to the horizon if you could see that far. They don't have Second World War assets like radar, which would have enabled them to fire on unseen targets. So this is line of sight on a very bad day for visibility. So it doesn't matter how big and powerful your guns are, you simply cannot hit the enemy because you can't see them until you get to around 12,000 meters. That's less than half of your maximum range. This is going to impact the battle. It will advantage the Germans who have shorter ranged artillery. It will penalize the British who have longer ranged artillery. The faster these ships travel, the thicker the smoke, and when smoke is reinforced by massive amounts of cordite being fired, the visibility deteriorates throughout the day. Long before the sun goes down, visibility is very poor, and that has a bearing on the way the battle is fought. So we have to remember this is not fought in a perfect Mediterranean day. It's fought in a very bad North Sea day, and that changes everything. Here are the facts and figures. The British have 151 ships, the Germans 99. The British outnumber the Germans in battleships, battle cruisers. The Germans have no armored cruisers present, light cruisers, destroyers. They also have a seaplane carrier, and one seaplane will take off during this battle. No submarines are involved, although the British do think they might be there. And the figures for the end of the battle are also significant. The Germans suffer lower casualties. They lose less ships, they lose less men. Does that mean they win the battle? Simple answer is no. Battles are not decided by casualties. They're decided by who holds the ground that is being fought over, or in the case of the sea, who holds command of communications. So here are the concentration points and the opening two sections of the battle. And I'll run through this while this image is up. The British were aware from their radio intercepts that the Germans were planning a sortie from Wilhelmshaven, the dead center of the map, north. The Germans were planning to intercept a British convoy coming from Norway to draw the British out over a submarine ambush that was placed outside the Orkney Islands and the Firth of Forth. They hoped by this tactic that they would do serious damage to the British fleet before it could even get into a battle. So the Germans are trying to level the balance of power by using submarines. The British commander, Jellicoe, sails late on the 30th of May before the Germans even set sail. That's how good British intelligence is. They anticipate the German movement. The Germans sail early on the 31st. Admiral Beatty, who is coming out of the Firth of Forth, commands the battle cruiser fleet. These are the high-speed capital ships, which sacrifice some protection to achieve significantly higher speed. These forces are intending to concentrate somewhere in the Skagerrak area. Jellicoe had been planning to send a detachment down the Kattegat towards Copenhagen to threaten the Baltic approaches, but for the German sortie, that operation may well have brought the German fleet to sea anyway. A threat to enter the Baltic was certainly a very serious concern for the Germans. The Germans think that they will surprise the British. The British are expecting to meet the Germans in overwhelming force somewhere in the Skagerrak. Later in the day, as they're steaming across the North Sea, Jellicoe is told that the Germans are not at sea. He is misinformed. The radio intelligence is inaccurate. Scheer is at sea and he's moving north as fast as possible. So the forces are coming to collision when neither the Germans nor the British are anticipating combat. Jellicoe has actually slowed down his rate of steaming as a result of that fresh information. So the battle starts later than it might have done. And as a consequence, it is inconclusive. So control of intelligence is very important in this battle. And on this occasion, British intelligence, which was normally good, let down the admiral on the spot. He lost faith in the intelligence feeds that he was getting. The image at the top on the right-hand side is of the meeting engagement between the two battlecruiser forces. Admiral Beatty and Admiral Hipper command the respective battlecruiser forces. Beatty had already fought Hipper once and sunk one of his ships. He anticipates finishing the job today. He doesn't. Beatty makes a series of very poor tactical decisions. Instead of approaching the enemy steadily and building up a set of data on the enemy's range, course, and speed, he makes a radical change of course and fails to take adequate information from his range-finding equipment. He is therefore unaware exactly how close he is to the enemy when fire is opened at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At a range of 14,000 meters, this is the maximum range that's possible on this occasion. The British ships overshoot the Germans by a significant margin. The Germans find their target quickly, and within 20 minutes, HMS Indefatigable has been sunk in an action with one of the German ships. 20 minutes later, HMS Queen Mary also sinks. Both ships blow up when their magazines are set fire to by German projectiles. This is a catastrophic result, and Beatty's in a very dangerous position. So here is the approach to Copenhagen. Ultimately, this is what it's all about, keeping the British out of the Baltic or drawing the Germans into battle somewhere near the Baltic approaches. And you see they're right in the middle of Denmark, the term Jutland. The British will name this battle after a land feature. The Germans will name it after the sea feature, the Skagerrak, the sea area, which is somewhat ironic given the Germans are land people and the British are naval people. Here we see Hipper and Beatty. Beatty is the larger of the two because he had the bigger ego. Beatty really did believe that he was the best admiral, but on the day, Hipper made him look very second-rate. Hipper's performance on the day was exceptional. He handled his ships with great skill. His leadership was exemplary, and he provided a masterclass in how to fight from a weak position against a more powerful enemy. Beatty, who was occasionally quite capable, made a series of very poor mistakes, which led him to try and alter the official record after the battle. Something that no admiral should ever try to do. Beatty's flagship, HMS Lion, was the glamorous ship of the entire Royal Navy, a very large battle cruiser with 8 13.5-inch guns capable of 29 knots, about 32 miles an hour. A very impressive ship, not as strongly built perhaps as some of the German ships, but faster and more powerful. Beatty's force was backed up by 4 fast battleships of the Queen Elizabeth class, which were commanded by Admiral Evan Thomas. But Beatty had not fully integrated them into his force, and in his radical change of course to engage the Germans, he did not signal to Evan Thomas to explain his intentions, and so a gap opened up between Beatty and his battleship support. This would prove to be a serious mistake. Here is Indefatigable sinking, and you get some sense of what a murky day it is. We've got a huge slew of black smoke stretching across the screen, but not much beyond the range at which Indefatigable is sinking. Everything is covered in grey cloud. This is a very murky day. This ship was just blown up. Of a 1,000-man crew, 4 will survive. They were 4 people who were not inside the ship. About 400 tons of high explosive have just detonated, and everything and every body that was inside the strong metal box has been pulverized and destroyed. There were no wounded survivors. Only those outside the ship, those on the bridge, were able to escape. Here is the Queen Mary blowing up in an enormous explosion. And this is a German celebratory postcard with an X marks the spot in case you don't know where the Queen Mary is. The Germans made a great deal of this ship blowing up. It was named after the Queen of England, so it was quite a significant victory for them. Here is the original photograph. It's one of the loudest and largest explosions in the world before Hiroshima. What had happened to the British ships? Why had they sunk in such catastrophic form? Well, this picture tells us all we need to know. This is the midships turret on HMS Lion. At the height of the battle, shortly after the Queen Mary blew up, this turret was hit by a German 12-inch projectile, and it struck the turret right between the two gun barrels. It entered the turret, exploded, and blew the roof off the turret and killed most of the gun crew. It did not destroy the ship because this ship had its safety systems preventing flash in the turret getting down into the magazine, which was at the bottom of the ship's hull. In Queen Mary and Indefatigable, and in another to increase the rate of fire. So the airtight interlocks, which blocked fire from traveling from the gun chamber down to the magazine, have been removed. They'd been put back on Lion, so while the turret was damaged and the crew were killed, the ship did not explode. This was not a failure of British design or indeed of protection. It was a failure of operator procedure. In fairly basic terms, they hadn't put the seatbelt on, and the consequences were fatal. This also was the responsibility of Admiral Beatty. It was his squadron, and he was responsible for making sure it was operated in a safe and effective way. He was rescued from worse catastrophe by the arrival of the battleships Warspite, Malaya, Valiant, and Barham, which proceeded to do a great deal of damage to the German battle cruisers. Just before, Admiral Scheer turned up from the south, at which point Beatty and his supporting battleships retired to the north to draw Admiral Scheer's main fleet into an action with Admiral Jellicoe's force. And if we go back to this image, you will see in the bottom right hand what happens at that battle. So the Germans are coming up as the red line from the south. Jellicoe is not given accurate information about their course or speed. Beatty fails to provide the information. Jellicoe is arriving in a force of 6 separate columns steaming side by side. In order to fire all of his guns on the broadside, he needs to deploy into a single line of battle. He has to judge when to do this, and he has to be in position when the enemy appears. And given the short range at which he will see the enemy, this is the critical decision, possibly of the entire First World War. Which side does he deploy on? When does he deploy? Jellicoe makes the signal equal speed Charlie London, which basically deploys onto the port side or left-hand column to form a line of sunk. Night fighting is fairly confused. What the battle demonstrates is that the British have command of the sea. They are able to retain that command of the sea, and there is very little the Germans can do about that. German losses are not as heavy as British losses, but as the battle performance of this ship, HMS Tiger, one of the British battle cruisers, demonstrates. This ship took 14 heavy shell hits and was still perfectly functional at the end of the battle. The British suffered almost no damage to their battleships. They reached the next morning with a stronger fleet than the Germans. The Germans had many damaged ships, but the Germans had managed to escape, get back through one of their deep channels, and were closing in on returning to base. Jellicoe had not been given the information he needed. The British intelligence system, which knew where Scheer was going, had failed to inform him. In all, the final judgment has to be that Jellicoe fought a very good tactical battle.